I grew up in North Texas, and one of my friends has a cow farm and a lot of land. The name of the street he lived on was his family name. Me and my friends would go out there a lot on weekends, way out on the land far from his house, bring a guitar and some weed, and make a campfire and just hang out. One summer night, my friend asked if we wanted to see a haunted house. He said it wasn't really haunted per se, but it was out in the middle of nowhere, and was abandoned. He said he'd driven by it a few times on farm routes, but had never had the stones to go explore it himself, especially not at night. It was one of those times where no one wanted to be the first to say no, so we all said yes. It was a cool, clear night, and we piled into my friend's sedan. We were listening to some good old classic rock tunes and generally enjoying ourselves. We came to an area where we had to drive over a very old river, which was now a narrow stream. This stream had eroded this patch of land for so long that it had become a very, very steep depression. There was a large plank of wood across the remainder of the stream, making it flat enough to drive across. Our friend assured us it was safe for the car, even though it looked like the angle was too steep for the car to cross without being damaged. By this point, the atmosphere had changed. We were no longer just hanging out or fancy-free. A few of us were speaking because we were just looking at the windows at the dark and the looming trees and expanse of moonlit grass. We held our breaths as we crossed the stream, and when we crossed it, there was a sea change in the way it felt. It was as if I could sense the house getting closer. No one had said a word for the past 10 minutes, other than my friend giving us time estimates on how much further we were from it. There was nothing out here, not even a paved road. There was a dirt road formed from cars, but it was very old and overgrown, as if it had not been used except, perhaps, sparingly for a decade. Suddenly I became aware of something that had been present for a good portion of the trip, but had occurred so slowly that I hardly noticed. I broke the silence. Everything's in black and white. Everyone else in the car started to freak out, because they could only see black and white too. There was no color anywhere, just shades of black like an old photo. "Are we dead?" I asked. I was convinced we had died along the way, but had not been aware that we were dead, like in a horror movie. I still had no explanation for this. We pulled up to the house and the color had returned, it seemed, but it was too dark that it didn't matter anyway. The house was 2 stories at a slight tilt, and the face of the house looked menacingly down at us. It was an old southern house with white pillars that had become discolored with age, a faux balcony jutting out from under the 2nd-story window, and about 50 meters from the house was a large metallic silo. As the headlights from our car washed over the area, the darkness took its time to leave because it had become so settled there. We began walking slowly towards the house. In the front yard there were lots of holes in the ground, freshly dug, about the size to fit a small potted plant. Inside the holes we found crumpled up pieces of paper. On the paper were crude drawings, like children's drawings. They were of people. Stick figures. Some of the stick figures would be upside down or laying down. Some of them had faces, and they were all sad or yelling about something. We went into the silo, which was unlocked. We went in with a flashlight and lit up the interior portion by portion with a beam from the flashlight. It was totally empty and gleamed like polished chrome. It smelled like sawdust and old oats. I swore I heard the sound of a girl crying, but that might have just been the sound of the hinges on the door. I'll keep telling myself that. Finally, we went to the house. The doors were all broken off the hinges. There was a screen door, and it was partially torn. We went inside. We broke up into groups and tried to explore the whole thing. We were all trying to seem brave, saying things like, "The thing I'm most afraid of is the floor falling in." There were closets, and we'd hold our breath before we'd open the doors, but found nothing inside. The whole house was completely dark and empty. We only had one flashlight, so there might have been parts that we had missed, but we wanted to get the hell out of there. We got back in the car, and one of my friends dared someone to go into the house by himself and sit on the living room and close his eyes for 30 seconds. He said he would do it. I couldn't believe it. I could never do it. He walked off proudly towards the house. We saw him go in. The living room was the first room on the first floor past the foyer beyond the door. Several minutes passed and we thought he was messing with us, wanting one of us to go in after him so that he could give them a scare. Well, that's when we noticed the smell. Something smelled really awful in the car. My friend, who was driving, looked down and saw a dead cat crammed down underneath the pedals. Then we noticed there was cat fur strewn about the car. We freaked out and started honking the horn and flashing the headlights at the house. Our friend didn't come out. Finally, me and another friend went in after him. When he got to the living room, we found him sitting on the floor, huddled over, his back to the wall, with his arms wrapped around his knees and his head buried in his legs. He looked up at us as if we should run away, as if it was too late. We told him to get his ass so that we could get out of there, and he pointed to the wall behind us. The lights from the car were still flashing, trying to get us to leave. Each time the lights flashed, we could see it. All of our names were written on the wall in red. Later that summer, a friend of mine went back to the house during the day and burnt it down. I was a leasing agent. We deal with a surprisingly high amount of deaths. Brant was my worst suicide and most creepy. I'll never forget him, and he made sure of that. Brant was a weird resident, but nice, always chatted with me, and you could tell he was hurting from his PTSD. Around Christmas, his packages sat too long in the office for pickup, and I figured he was on vacation. Shortly after New Year's, his parents called and asked to speak to me directly. Manager hands me the phone, and they tell me they haven't been able to get a hold of him for weeks, as they live out of state. I tell them to call the police department, as we're not allowed due to privacy laws, and I grab my keys and head for his apartment. His dog, Ricky, was barking. I check the front door and it cracks open, and the smell hit my face like a ton of bricks. He's dead, and had been dead. The police arrive. Turns out Brant shot himself and sat for 10 days. I had to ID him before they called his family. The dog actually started to eat him, due to not going out for so long. The residents above and on the side and behind noped out, and we let them go. At this point, I think I'm losing my mind, because I keep seeing Brant out of the corner of my eyes at work. Only at work. Sometimes I'd see him walk by the office window, and I would yell for my manager, who believed me, but thankfully, she never saw him. After about a month of this, we get his place cleaned up and turned over the apartments to a pair of little Korean sisters who moved in next door. The apartment shares a wall with his bedroom. At this point, no one in the area knows what happened, and because of Brant being a shut-in, no one knew him or who he was. Cookie, one of the sisters, comes in and asks me one day if someone died in their apartment. I tell her no. She says there's a man around her apartment and is distraught about not being able to cross over. At this point, I ask her if she's seen him, and she describes Brant. I tell her about what happened, and she assures me she'll do a crossover ceremony for him that evening, and also gave me a bit of sage later that day. I never saw or felt Brant again after that night. Back in 2005, my husband and I moved into our new home, and we were so happy. It was a 3-bedroom attached with a front and back garden, and literally a stone's throw away from my family. It was perfect. Doing the house up was amazing, and I loved putting our stamp on it, making it our home, and hopefully one day having a baby, and completing our perfect family. With both of us working full-time, we pretty much kept to ourselves, and didn't really know any of our neighbors. But as the months went on, we eventually got to know the lady to the right of us, and we ended up becoming really friendly with her for the next 12 years of our time in that house. She was older, and in the winter we would offer to get her shopping, etc., and would always keep an eye on her. The neighbours to the left, though, were a completely different story. They seemed nice and would always say hi when we saw them, and were a bit older than my husband and I. But boy did they like to argue. Every Friday night the music would start around 7 p.m, and by the time 11 p.m. came around, we would hear them arguing, and it would get louder and louder, and usually stop at around 1 a.m. Saturday night would then come around, and the cycle would start all over again. It didn't bother us, and it didn't really get to the stage where we would call the police. It was just a drunk couple arguing over something trivial, which would be forgotten in the morning, as always, and as loved up the next day whenever we saw them. They didn't even seem embarrassed, but each to their own, I guess. After a while it came to the stage where we would time when they would start arguing, and have bets when they would kick off. This went on for about a year, and that's when everything changed, and the most hellish night of our lives was about to happen. Life went on as normal. The arguing continued, and a year later we were blessed with a beautiful baby boy. We were so excited. My perfect family was now complete, and we couldn't be happier. One beautiful spring night, my husband and I were tired, and decided to get cozy in bed with the baby and watch TV. It was a Sunday night, so we knew there wouldn't be any issues from the neighbours. But we were very wrong. To let you know the layout of our house, our bedroom windows look straight out into our front garden. We can also see our neighbour's garden, all the way down to the bottom of his path, just because the window is situated more to his side. We also have a huge grass verge in front of the row of houses with a small hill on it, which people use to cut through or walk their dogs. Just as I got the baby to sleep, we heard the neighbour coming out of his path and shouting at someone on the grass. Just as I got the baby to sleep, we heard the neighbour coming out into his path and shouting at someone on the grass at the verge. My husband and I both look at each other thinking, this is Sunday. What are they up to now? We turned the TV down and listened to what was happening, but the voices were too quiet to hear. We went back to watching TV, and about 5 minutes later we heard a scuffle, a thud, and then the sound of someone running. Seconds later the neighbour's girlfriend came out, and we heard the most blood-curdling scream. We rushed to the window, and there was my neighbour's girlfriend cradling his body, lifeless, in her arms by the path. We were in absolute shock. I started crying. My husband closed the blinds and told me not to look out the window again. The emergency services arrived pretty much straight away, and a forensics team was soon on the scene. The police came to our door and asked if we heard anything, but in all honesty, we knew what they were like, so we didn't pay that much attention till we heard the screaming. We eventually found out our neighbour had died of his injuries as soon as the street was cordoned off and police were everywhere. It was later found out he had owed someone money, and when he couldn't pay up, the guy hit him over the head with a brick, killing him instantly. It was the most horrific night of our lives, seeing that poor man laying there like that, and then finding out he was actually dead. It was horrible. That girl's scream will live with me forever. Life had to go on, unfortunately, and eventually, the house went up for sale. Through town gossip, we heard she put the house up for sale as she couldn't cope living in the house her boyfriend died in, and soon new people moved in. The new neighbours were lovely, and like us they kept to themselves. Our weekend became quiet, but I don't think we'll ever get over what happened to that poor man. Roll on 2 years. It was a cold and dark winter morning. My husband was leaving early for work and put my son in bed beside me to get cozy. About an hour later, I was waking up from my sleep as I could hear my son giggling. I thought I was still dreaming, but as I came, his giggle got louder. I looked over at him, and there he was giggling away, looking over at the bedroom window. I thought, what's he looking at? I couldn't see anything, and I thought, Is there a breeze moving the blinds? And he's laughing at them moving? Eventually, I asked, "What are you laughing at, darling?" What he said next made me tremble. "The man at the window," as if it was an everyday occurrence. I laughed with nerves. "What man?" And my son, without missing a beat, replied, "The funny man at the window," and continued to giggle. I was frozen with fear. When you watch horror movies as much as I do, your mind works overtime. I didn't know what to do. He kept giggling as if someone was just making funny faces at him or something. After about 5 minutes of lying there thinking what the hell, I finally plucked up the courage to pick him up and take him downstairs to the living room. The whole time I was down the stairs, I tried to act normal for my son's sake, but I kept looking up the stairs as if something or someone was going to walk down them. I was petrified. As soon as the sun came up, I ventured back up the stairs, opened all the blinds to let the light in, and both of us got dressed and went out for the day. When my husband got home, I told him all about it, but he thinks that he must just have a wild imagination. Every morning through that winter, I was dreading my husband leaving for work, but nothing like that ever happened again. My son is 15 now. On the odd occasion when I mention it to him, he can't remember. Could it have been my dead neighbor, making my son laugh all those years ago? He never had a chance to meet him after all. Perhaps it was his way of saying hello. What do you all think? This first story happened in Mexico, when my parents, sister and nieces and I were finally able to visit our family there about 4 years ago. We were at my great aunt's house, and her 3 adult children were also there. They have a 2-story home where they run a small mechanical repair shop from the first floor and mainly reside on the second, with the exception of the living room and bathroom being on the first floor with the shop. When you take the stairs onto the floor above, you immediately enter the open area for the kitchen, where they have a small bar seating area at the top of the stairs and landing, and the dining room with a large dining table. I was sitting on the bar stool closest to the stairs. My younger sister was sitting next to me, and my 2 older sisters were standing across the bar from me. My parents, great aunt, and my aunts and uncles were all sitting across the dining room table. My sisters and I were all chatting and laughing, and everyone was having a great time, enjoying good company, when suddenly I feel like someone grabbed me from behind in a bear hug manner, and I felt my body slightly tilt back into the hug. I chuckled and quickly turned around, thinking I must not have heard whoever walked up the stairs and hugged me, only to find there was no one standing behind me. It didn't feel like a threatening presence, but I immediately tried to debunk it by rocking the bar stool, thinking I must have unbalanced on there, or something, but it didn't rock. By this point, my sisters are all looking at me funny and asking what I'm doing, and I just tell them I felt someone hug me from behind and felt myself tilt back into the hug, and they just looked at me like I was weird. I stepped out to their courtyard, which was directly connected to the kitchen and dining room, to get some fresh air, and had only been out there for a minute or 2 when my mum came out and says, "Is it true? You felt someone hug you from behind the top of the stairs?" I told her that that's what it felt like, and that I might need some fresh air. My mum's eyes immediately start to water, and she said, "I think that was your great uncle. He used to do that to everyone who was sitting there whenever he came upstairs from the shop." She then made me come inside, and my great aunt and my aunt and uncles were all starting with tears in their eyes. My great uncle passed away about 10 years ago prior to that happening. I'd only met him once when I was 4, which was 20 years prior to this trip. They said that my great uncle must have wanted to say hi to us and let us know how happy he was to see everyone together. This next story happened about 7 or 8 years ago, when I was spending the night with my boyfriend, now husband. Michael was living with his brother and sister-in-law and their 2 kids to help them out financially, since they were struggling a bit with the expenses of a toddler and a new baby. I would go over to help watch the kids while their parents went to work and try to help them with childcare. This particular night, The kids' parents had to work the late shift, so it was extremely late, around 2 a.m. by the time they got home. By the time they arrived, I was feeling too late to drive the 10 minutes to my parents' house, so I just stayed to spend the night there with Michael. The room was kind of small, and Michael had his bed pushed up against one wall, so the head and one side of the mattress touched the wall. He had a nightstand next to the bed, and also had a small recliner in the corner of the room. That was basically all he could fit in there because of how small the room was. He was sound asleep, and when I came into the room, snoring and all, sleeping on the side nearest the wall was Michael. I have trouble falling asleep to begin with, but that night was extra difficult because I kept feeling very uncomfortable, as I felt as if someone was staring at me when I was trying to fall asleep. As much as I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I was beyond exhausted, especially after dealing with a toddler and a newborn, and I just wanted to sleep. But every time I started dozing off, something kept telling me to wake up and remain alert. After about 20 minutes, I finally decided that I absolutely had to fall asleep and pulled the covers up to my face, where only my eyes and upwards were uncovered. Within 30 seconds of me doing that, Michael suddenly sits up and shouts, she's here, get the light," and reached around me to get his phone from the nightstand to illuminate the room. The screen lights up, and he's moving the phone around the room and no one's there. I'm freaking the hell out, asking him, who's here? He sets the phone back down and tells me, "Nothing. Never mind, go back to sleep," and promptly lays back down and says nothing else after that. I am in full-blown what the hell mode, and turn on the light to reveal the empty bedroom with just me and him and his bedroom furniture in it. I turn the light off and lay there terrified, eventually allowing my exhaustion to knock me out until my alarm rings for me to get up for work a few hours later. Michael goes to work and I head home to get ready for work, but send him a message that we need to talk about what happened the night before. He tells me he doesn't remember and tried to blow me off. Later that night, we met up for dinner, and I again ask about the night before, when he sighs heavily and says, "I don't know who it was. All I know is that I saw her standing at the foot of the bed, reaching to take the covers off your face to get you." He had been asleep and snoring the whole time, and the room was pitch black. He couldn't have known that I had the covers up to my eyes that night. Needless to say, I never slept in that house again. I was at my grandpa's house in southern Indiana at the time. He had a really long driveway, so I drove a golf cart to get the mail. As I was coming up, I swear I saw my great-grandpa, who had been dead for a few years by then. I looked over at the passenger side and saw him smiling at me. It scared me so much I slammed on the brakes and looked back, but he was gone. Then I saw something running into the woods that looked like a human. I tried to drive away but was stuck in mud, so I got out and ran the west of the way. I told everyone, and they ran down to check. As they were going, my aunt told me that ever since we got their grandpa's dog, he'd been acting crazy, so we think someone was out there. There was also a short story where in the 4th of July my sister saw a toddler roll down the hill and hit her head. She panicked, told my mum, and by the time they looked back, the girl was gone. Judging by how scared my sister was, she couldn't have faked it either. My family has experienced a lot of things just like that. I work at the Winchester Mystery House, and one late afternoon, I was up on the 3rd floor cleaning some windows. It was about 4:45 to 5, and by this time the last tour had already passed through my area, so I was alone, completely alone, in the chilling silence of the most haunted floor of the house. Nothing happened at this time, but I was feeling uncomfortable to say the least, as I'd only been working there a few months, so this was the most time I'd spent up there alone after this experience, and I vowed to never go up there by myself again. Here's the rest of the story. I was finishing up the last few windows in the room that I was in because I looked down at my watch and it was approaching my clock out time. Now, as I mentioned, no one was up there. As if someone had been, they've been lying to me for over 2 years about this day. I started to head out the room where I was cleaning and looked around to check just in case someone was waiting to jump out and scare me, but there was no one there. I began to head down the hallway, looking in the room that we call the South Turret, Witch's Cat. I then get a chill that rolls down my spine, and the feeling was that of one of not being alone. Someone was watching me from the shadows. It started to dance in the dimly lit hallway. I stopped, then turned around just to check, and of course nothing was there. I brush it off as just nerves since I was alone up there for the first time. As I take my first step, I hear it, a small whisper coming from the end of the hallway in the area I had just come from. I stop dead in my tracks and hold my breath to hear. Then I hear it again. Someone was calling my name from what I believe was the South Turret Witch's Cat. I sometimes still hear it in the back of my mind, and it terrifies me, and I ran out almost trampling a co-worker coming up the stairs. Since that day, whenever I'm up there, something's bound to happen to me. Whether it's a small tug of my hair or a pull of my skirt, or simply just a feeling. Whatever's up on the 3rd floor is very interested in me, and I've been there for over 2 years and never heard the voice again. But I'll never forget that moment of pure and utter fear. There have been reports of a woman wearing a black gown pacing the hallway or twirling around in the witch's cap. I've never seen her, but I'm dead set that she was calling to me. First, I should give you a little background about me, and also my friend. I was a young, dumb kid, but was good in school, responsible, and very into the paranormal. I was close to 16 when this happened. My friend, Brittany, was better than me in school, more responsible, and equally into the paranormal. She was 16 when this happened. Our friendship centered around hanging out, watching TV, playing basketball, gaming, and a multitude of other things. We were always together. Another interest of ours was visiting haunted locations and try to ghost hunt. We both became passionate about this around age 8. We would gather up our EMF detectors, dowsing rods, cameras, and audio recorders. Then, we would descend to the chosen location. We did this for years, probably closer to a decade before we ever saw anything. The first location we chose together as children was a cemetery about 4 miles away, located in North Glen, Colorado. We rode our bikes there in the middle of the day, and when we finally arrived, we spent our time walking around taking photos and gathering audio recordings. I remember getting a lot of shifty looks from people. Neither Brittany or I understood why. It was because we were 2 kids alone midday in a cemetery. People were probably creeped out, or at bare minimum, pissed off by our presence, which is completely understandable looking back on it now. Now that you have some background info, let's jump forward to when we were both 16. We were sitting in her living room. It was about 9:30 p.m, and the sun was just barely glinting over the horizon as it was setting. After several minutes of debating about what we should do, we both settled on going for a drive on Riverdale Road. This is a notoriously haunted road, and many people claim to have seen paranormal happenings. Not to mention, this road has a deep history of slavery, black magic, ritualistic sacrifice, and death in general. Seriously, this is one of America's most haunted locations. My history with this road prior to the night in question only consisted of goosebumps, chills, and creepy vibes. I often went to Riverdale during the day to smoke weed with my other friend, Joseph. We liked this location because it was fairly secluded but close, and during the day, it's actually a pretty drive. Some people have small farms over there, and the area is fairly spacious. The road wraps all the way around those lands, and it's a nice little drive during the day. At night, it is still secluded and close, but it is also dark, eerie, and horrifying. I have been to Riverdale countless times, both in the day and night, and I never saw anything paranormal. Cut back to driving towards Riverdale Road with my friend Brittany. It was around 10:30 p.m. when we turned onto the desolate road. As the headlights scanned across the street, we could see the darkness absorb them into the shadowy abyss. In other words, it was very dark as we began our descent onto Riverdale Road. As we inched our way along the road, we were both feeling a little uneasy, but we decided to brush it off and continue forward. As we rolled up to the first stop on Riverdale Road, out of nowhere, a light brown wax-like smiling face with no eyes was inching from the car. We both freaked out, but then started to realize it was just a horse pushing his nose through the middle of a fence. We both felt completely ridiculous and started to laugh about how scared we got over a horse's nose. Still feeling a bit ridiculous, we continued down the road to resume our adventure. We drove down the dimly lit roads of Riverdale for what felt like hours, and unfortunately we didn't see much of it at all. Feeling a little disappointed, we decided it was time to leave and drive back to North Glen. Turning the car towards one of the exits, we accelerated forwards and slowed the vehicle about 50 feet before approaching a red stoplight. Without warning, a translucent grayscale ghost appeared in front of us. It appeared slightly to the right, off the road between the car and the stoplight. It was like looking at a person that was standing behind a thick layer of fog. But there wasn't any fog that night. You could see 85% of the ghost's body, while the other 15 was completely invisible. And as we laid our eyes upon the ghostly figure, it ran from the right side of the road towards the left. When it reached the middle of the road, it was about 15 feet in front of us, and from this distance you could start to see some finer details. It seemed to emanate a soft white glow, but at the same time you could almost see through it, as if you were looking through a dusty window. I could tell by its positioning and the way it moved that it didn't intend on stopping at the car. It seemed to have a hurried demeanor about it, as if it knew where it was going, and everything in between was just an obstacle. We watched as it picked up speed towards the left side of the road, continuing off into a field where it literally faded away from existence, and we couldn't see it anymore. Brittany and I sat at the light in complete shock and awe. My heart was beating in my throat, and all I could hear was Brittany repeating my name. Vince! Vince! All I could do at this point was put my head between my knees and wrap my arms around myself, kind of like what you do in a fetal position. We just sat there for the last 30 seconds before I could even say a word. I don't even recall what exactly we said to each other after that, or how we both even got home that night. But I do remember that we left pretty quickly afterwards. In the end, our friendship began to drift for a bit, and we both took different paths. My path led me to Washington, and hers to becoming the incredible mother she is today. We've briefly chatted a few times since that night, but each time she has never spoken to me about what we saw, and each time she has refused to even address it. This encounter has stuck with me my entire life. I replay it over and over in my head almost every day because I do obsess about this encounter. I have done quite a bit of Googling on Riverdale and all of the different encounters others have experienced on the road. Many people claim to have seen ghosts, some claim to have picked up ghostly hitchhikers, and others have seen chimera apparitions that try to run them off the road. But what I find most interesting is the notorious story about a jogger that went to Riverdale Road and was killed in a hit and run. Rumor has it that he's constantly haunting the road in search of the car that hit him that fateful night. And I can't help but wonder if the ghost that we saw was the very same jogger. I hope you enjoyed the only ghostly encounter I've ever experienced in my life. It has shook me violently to my core, and I still feel the same way I did that night when I think about it all these years later. I'm 27 years now, but the memory still haunts me every day. I feel lucky to have seen a ghost, but this experience has made me more uneasy in the dark, and I feel like I'm constantly waiting for my next ghostly encounter, kind of like some form of PTSD. I also think back to the horse, and how he was so close to the fence, and how he pushed his nose so far through the gap. It makes me wonder if he was also spooked that night. One time when I was younger, my family stayed over at my cousin's place because it was a large family gathering. We were staying in the living room. My brother and I were sleeping on the floor on these mats, so it wasn't on the hard floor. It was the middle of the night, and I couldn't fall asleep. I remember looking at the clock, and it's the middle of the night, a little past midnight, and I looked towards the staircase several feet away from me and saw a white figure walking down and walk into the wall leading outside. The figure continued doing it all night until dawn. I remember being so scared and turned over towards my brother, but he wasn't waking up. I kept looking at the red number on the digital clock, waiting for sunrise. I felt this heavy sensation on top of me the whole time, while that figure kept walking down the stairs, before it finally disappeared. I felt it look at me before continuing their routine. I asked my cousin's kids and they told their mum and she yelled at me. A little while later, my family went back and I stood at the staircase and left candies as offerings before walking away. But I swear it was super scary and uncomfortable. I rented a house, and within 3 months of moving in, some weird stuff began to happen. The first thing you need to know is that the previous owner had passed away in the said house after living their whole life there. So on to the story. I was standing in my kitchen, my friend in the living room talking to me. I was telling him how the TV would turn on and off on its own, as well as doors opening and other strange things that started happening recently. I had a drink mixer station on the top of my fridge in the kitchen. The fridge was flat and level as could be. Right as I told him I was getting a little spooked, the drink mixer flings in the middle of the room and drops in the middle of the kitchen. Every little glass jar of mixer shattered. These are thick little glasses that I could have dropped from a high height on my wood floor, and they would have literally been fine. They were flung into the middle of the kitchen and the floor, at least 6 feet away, and didn't touch the fridge at all. My friend and I just stared at each other, mouths open wide, and immediately we yelled out at the top of our lungs to stop messing with us, and that I was going to take good care of their home, and to please stop. I never had anything happen again after that, but I do believe there are spirits out there and forces at work that we don't know about. Gives me goosebumps just remembering it. This is my mother's story, and I believe her. It's about a creature she used to call the Night Mother. In the late 60s/early 70s, she moved with her family to her grandmother's house in Rhineland, Germany. The house was big and old, a classy ghost house with a big garden and farmland they had to work on. The grandmother was a mean creature. My grandparents had 7 children. One of the boys, the eldest, who got his own room, and 6 girls who had to share the other. The girls were between the ages of 4 and 12. That's when it all started. They all claim that at nights, when they would lie in bed, 2 of them sharing one, a woman dressed in black would visit their room. She would stand at the foot of each bed, sometimes tugging at them a little bit closer with the blankets and watching them. She had skeletal fingers. Never spoke to them. It wasn't every night, but it was quite regular, and they were all scared to death every time it happened. No one moved or said anything, just stared at her. A few of the younger ones would be already asleep. They gave her the name Abendmutter, which in German translates to Night Mother. And they say that they didn't have the feeling that she was evil, but more protecting. Of course they were scared of her because who wouldn't be? One aunt remembers that in the first night she whispered, "Can you see that too?" to her sister, who nodded. They can't remember if they ever tried speaking to her. When they told their parents, it was pushed off as a nightmare, and no one really cared at the time. Everyone was working 12-hour days, even the children often helping them. Every one of my aunts remembered this story, and they don't talk about it often, and feel uncomfortable when I asked about it as a kid, but they are all 100% convinced it occurred. I tried a lot of explanations, mass hallucinations, their grandmother dressing up and being a psychopath torturing her grandchildren, maybe coping with the trauma they all shared together, but I could never really be sure what they saw or why. I was about 4 when this happened. I had seen shadows on the wall and stuff like that. I told my parents and was met with the whole overactive imagination thing. My parents also had their instances with the paranormal, but weren't all that worried about them. That was until one calm night in the summer. My house has the front door leading to a set of stairs that takes you to the living room with the hallway attached. The hallway first has the bathroom on the right, then the baby room for my soon arriving little brother, my room at the end to the left, and my parents' room right across from it. I don't remember what time it was, other than it was past midnight on Friday, so actually really early Saturday morning, I wake up to heavy footfalls in the hallway. I mean heavy graveyard boots, and the dude who was wearing them had enough of today's type heavy gear, so after hearing this I booked it to my parents' room. I thought I would have to wake them, but the footsteps were so loud that they were also awoken by them. I jumped on their bed, immediately got under the covers and told them what happened. They were both still groggy from waking up so suddenly and didn't realize if they'd heard the footfalls or not. That was until they sounded like they were right outside my parents' bedroom door. Another thing I should mention is we always left the doors open in our rooms when there wasn't any company in the house, so we saw nothing at the door, but sure as hell heard it. My dad immediately grabbed his 9mm from under his pillow and cleared the entire house. There was nobody else but us 3. Nothing happened for the rest of the night. We couldn't explain what happened the next morning, so we went on with chores we had planned. In the hallway we have 2 small carpets. We picked them up and brought them outside since they needed a legitimate wash, not just to be vacuumed. As my dad and I were hosing the carpets down outside, my mum went back in to do vacuuming. She quickly ran back outside to grab my dad and I. When we walked back into the hallway, we were stunned. There were boot marks on the wood floor under the carpet. Keep in mind the carpets had no imprints or dirt on them. They were just old and dusty. To this day, my family can't explain what happened. We just accept that it did. My family and I had just moved to Council Grove, Kansas from Greenville, South Carolina. We went from the beaches and mountains to the flatlands of Kansas. My grandparents had searched there for houses for us prior to moving, as there were 8 of us, not including my dad and stepmom. They found an old farmhouse that was built in 1872, and it came with a 3-room chicken coop, 3 outdoor sheds, 2 garages, an old train car, and 2 metal barns. To get a better understanding of the layout of my story, I will give you a description of the house. When you first enter the house, you could go straight down a set of 5 steps to the dirt-floored cellar, or go up the set of 3 steps to the closed-in back porch that led to the back door entrance of the house. Once you walked in the back door, it took you directly into the kitchen. Now the kitchen had a room entrance on either side, one to the living room and the other to the pantry, leading you into a bathroom. From the living room, there was the formal dining room off to the left, which had a bedroom off the side of it. Also off the living room was a doorway that led into a hallway with a set of stairs to a landing with another set of stairs leading to the second level of the house. Now through the doorway of the living room there was also a closet off to the side of the stairs, under the second set of stairs, and on the other side of the stairs is an entrance into our bathroom with the connecting door to the pantry. Going up the stairs past the first landing and up the next set lands you on the second floor hallway. There were rooms on both sides of it, 2 rooms directly in front of the top of the stairs and 1 directly to the right of the stairs. Of course, my parents took the bottom downstairs off the side of the formal dining room, and all of us kids were put in bedrooms upstairs. The 2 elder boys got their own rooms at each end of the hallway. My sisters and I were put in one of the rooms directly in front of the stairs, and my other 2 brothers were put in the room right next to us, which was also one of the rooms in front of the stairs. And they had decided to use the bedroom directly to the right of the stairs as storage for our Christmas decorations, clothing that didn't fit us, but would be reworn by a sibling who may fit it later. We were so excited and happy to have all of this space, as we literally had moved from a 3-bedroom house to a 6-bedroom one. We were there for almost a month, and had decided to pursue the ranching lifestyle. We invested in cows, bulls, chickens, roosters, rabbits and goats, and we also had gotten 2 dogs, a blue heeler and a red heeler, on top of the 2 German shepherds we already had. Every day my siblings and I had animal chores to do, and we gathered a routine for them as well. It was the end of summer, and school was going to begin within a week, so we were all staying out later and playing as it was a full moon that night. We decided to play hide and seek by using only the light provided by the moon. Now, seeing as our entire property was surrounded with pastures that held our livestock and corn, everything was lit up very well. On the one side of our house, there were some trees and all our hutches where we housed our livestock rabbits. I had gone to hide in a lower branched tree, where once comfortably perched in the branches. I looked out over the yard for the one who was it, and I waited there for what seemed like forever, and I finally saw who I had thought were 2 of my brothers walking from the chicken coop up to the back porch door, and they entered. I just remember being so mad because I had climbed up in this tree and had patiently waited to be found, and there they went, just leaving us all outside without telling us. I pumped down from the branch and started walking towards the back porch door to go yell at them for not telling us it was over, when my siblings all yelled at me for giving away the game as I came out from my hiding spot. Now I was about 9 years old at the time, so in my high-pitched annoying voice I screamed, "That's not fair." The only reason I came in from the hiding spot was because I swore I had seen Justin and Andrew walking inside. As Justin and Andrew came out from the outdoor shed, saying that there was no way that was even possible, as they were in there the entire time. After that, we looked at each other and darted for the back porch door and trampled over each other to get in. Once inside, we all piled in a line outside the bathroom off the kitchen, where we all took our turns going pee and washing up before all heading upstairs to go to bed before our parents woke up. None of us spoke about it again after that. Now it is winter time, and I am out feeding my calf Burger. I know, kinda twisted, but whatever. Now as I was out giving him his feed, I heard what sounded like an older woman who was in her late 40s/early 50s, rambling on about how the cost of wheat had dropped, and how he was supposed to feed his animals through the rest of the season. Mind you, my brothers were less than a football field's lengths away from where I was, but they were feeding the chickens and collecting their eggs. So at the time I'm starting to panic, just a little bit, and a stupid me with a cracked voice hollers out, Hello, is anyone there? I think you should come out, this is private property." My first thought was that my 2 older brothers had just gotten a 12-gauge shotgun for Christmas, and the bullets were under their beds in case something broke loose. My second thought was to let Daisy, our German shepherd, in the pen that was opened by the barn where I had heard this man talking frantically. At this point a few minutes had gone by, and I turned towards my brother and waved him over to where I was, and once he came over to me, I explained to him what I had heard, and what I had said. He stood there and waited for a few more minutes, and there it was again. The damn old man's voice screaming at this point. "This is my farm, my land, and you can leave before I come out." My brother and I's eyes met so fast we silently came to the agreement to beeline it to the back porch door, screaming for our other siblings to do the same as our parents weren't home. We all gathered in a circle in the living room on the floor, frantically explaining to everyone what just happened out in the barn. We debated telling our parents, mind you. Our dad was a very, very verbally and physically abusive guy who truly hated his kids and made it well known to all of us. And our stepmom, well, she liked to agonize and abuse us, so we ultimately decided to just act like nothing had ever happened. We began sharing chores with each other almost immediately after the event. Summer had finally arrived. The only reason this date stuck out so clearly to me was as it was my 10th birthday, June 2nd, 2001. It was a rather hot day, and my brother and I had walked out into one of the pastures back to a creek that ran through our entire property to catch frogs and swim a bit. My brothers had wandered upstream a little ahead of us, and I was too entertained by a bright yellow, orange, white butterfly that was fluttering around me as I was swimming. I heard Andrew holler out for me and say that Dad was going to be home soon, so we better get back to the house and finish our chores. Now, thinking about it, it definitely did not make any sense. We had left the house right after lunch. On the way back out the back door through the kitchen hung a clock featuring some apples, and it read about 12:03 p.m. The walk from the house to the creek was only about 10 minutes, and we had only been in the water not even 20. My dad worked till about 6 or 7 on a normal night, as he was a carpenter. Our stepmom was back in the house caring for our 9-month-old baby sister and 4-year-old baby brother, as she only worked in the early mornings at the local bakery in Council Grove. So without fail I listened and grabbed my shoes and wandered back down to the water to throw on my flip-flops, only to see my brother walking back over to me asking where I thought I was going. I stopped and shook my head, and kinda just assumed they were messing with me at this point. Mind you, we didn't have cell phones, nor did either of my parents, so here we are, 4 of us, because the other 4 stayed home, no phones, and just us with our towels. I wasn't about to stay down in this creek and have them try and scare me, so I began walking back towards the house. Mind you, I watched my brothers walk further down the creek as I was going in the opposite direction. While walking back through the tree brush, I saw what appeared to be 2 kids, a boy and a girl, roughly between 7 or 8 and 13 and 14. I blinked and rubbed my eyes and looked back, but this time they had moved a solid football field's length away from where I had seen them the first time. At this point, adrenaline had completely kicked into high gear, because before I knew it, I was halfway across our pasture, climbing over the little cattle gate and running across my driveway, not thinking twice about looking back. The weirdest part is when I got back up to the house, all of my siblings were somehow there. Literally, how is this even possible? They walked down there without me. I watched them go in the opposite way, and I walked back to the house. All I know is I went to the bathroom, got in the shower where I began sobbing, and had no idea what just happened. If this was all some kind of elaborate prank, they succeeded. But I don't think it was. My stepmom had told everyone to get cleaned up for dinner at this point, and I am completely on edge. I walked into the kitchen, sat down at the table to eat dinner, and after dinner I had to go do the dishes, clean the kitchen before I went to bed, and I immediately cleaned up after dinner to head to my room. Side note, my closet in my room had a hobbit door with a very long but very narrow storage space that we never used. My stepsister and I had a shared bedroom, and we had bunk beds. I was of course in the top bunk, lying down with the blanket over my head, trying to figure out exactly what had happened that day. But I kept drawing blanks, and was just left with more questions than answers. As I lay there, stumped, scared and confused, I somehow managed to fall asleep, and remember hearing my stepsister come into the room, as she was a very loud and heavy walker. I remember her leaving our bedroom door open, and shut off our light and crawled into her bed, and heard her snoring shortly after as I fell asleep too. Ashley, "Ashley, open your window. Ashley, please won't you let me in? Come on, I won't hurt you. Please open and let me in," is what I heard, as my eyes shot wide open and I could feel my heartbeat all the way to my toes. Absolutely terrified at this point, I threw the blankets over my head and closed my eyes so tight, hoping it would go away and that I was only dreaming. After a few minutes, nothing, so I started to relax a little bit and started to chuckle as I was about to finally breathe, and I thought to myself that I was just paranoid from the situation from down at the creek. I was able to finally go back to sleep after what felt like hours, but had to have only been 20 minutes. I woke up to the sound of the door that led you to the stairs from the living room open and close, followed with footsteps walking up the first 2 flights of stairs, then stopping and pausing when reaching the landing in between the 2 sets of stairs leading to the 2nd floor. I remember hearing someone whispering, but couldn't make out who it was or what they were saying. Then I hear the footsteps continue up the 2nd set of stairs all the way to the top. My body was frozen in sheer terror. It was almost as if this entire day and night was just one big nightmare, but it definitely wasn't. I threw my blanket over my face, but left my ears and the top of my head uncovered as I was trying to listen for who or what it was who I had heard walk up my stairs. I heard what sounded like 3 or more people walking up and down our hallway whispering to each other. Then I heard a little girl running up and down the hallway, entering my room laughing and running back to the hallway. This continued on for a while, and then I heard them all walk from the end of the hallway to my doorway, where I was finally able to make out what one said to the rest. "We have one awake with us, in here." I wanted to crap myself at this point, as I heard them all slowly walk from my doorway to where I literally could feel their presence surrounding my bed. My eyes squeezed shut so tight, I was not trying to see face to face with whoever was in my room. They were there for what felt like an eternity, mumbling after that, until I heard a girl's voice announce that he is in. I am thinking so many thoughts right now, but the one that stuck out the most was this cannot be real. I heard the footsteps retreating back to the hallway and everything fell silent. I waited a few more minutes before uncovering my face and breathing a sigh of relief, and that scared the crap out of me. I closed my eyes and tried to get more sleep. I rolled over and cracked my eye open and I heard, "Ashley, I got inside after all, and you didn't even help me." At this point it must have been between 5 and 6 a.m. The sky outside was starting to lighten. I made out this dark, tall and very broad figure staring right at me, with what appeared to be dark circles as eyes. Now again it's still dark with a hint of light in my bedroom. I closed my eyes and felt like someone had put me in a freezer. As fast as it happened, it was over. I was no longer cold and I opened my eyes to find nothing in my doorway, but heard my hobbit door in my closet slam closed. After that night I never slept without a light on. I never went back down to that creek unless it was to search for any missing or lost cattle. My siblings and I moved in with our grandparents a few short months after school had picked back up, due to all of the physical abuse we were enduring at the hands of my dad. Later on in life we had gotten together over dinner and drinks, and I had brought it up, and my brother looked so shocked when I told him what happened to me on my birthday that year, and about that night playing hide and seek in the moonlight. He then told me he had watched our younger brother and I walk from the chicken coop to the house, but when he saw me come out of the tree, he realized it wasn't, and decided to act tough considering he's my older brother. He also went on to tell me about how he had always heard what sounded like strangers in our home every night since we first moved in. We never went back to the property once we left. Good riddance. This took place right after I graduated college and was renting a crappy, very old house with my roommate, Megan, and her cat. The cat was a tabby named Ollie, and at best he was constantly annoyed. Like most girls with a new space, Megan was pretty excited about decorating. I was not as excited. being more of a submissive type. I let Megan do whatever she wanted with our walls and floors. Since we were both art students, we framed and hung some of our work downstairs. That lasted until the first party, because you can't have nice things and drunk college kids. It doesn't work. I should know. I personally ruined a bathroom. Anyway, Megan tried her best to make our bathroom look nice. We both agreed the bathroom was nice, but didn't feel welcoming. No matter what we put up, the room was uncomfortable. No matter what you were doing in there, you felt like someone was watching you, and you tried to leave as quickly as you could. We put in curtains, blinds, a blanket, and still felt like someone was watching. We put locks on the doors, added some nice bath mats, put up more lights, more pictures, and cleaned decals. None of it worked, and no matter how many candles or plug-in air fresheners we used, it would always smell like gin. The juniper-infused kind of gin. Megan couldn't smell it, but she was on a mission to make that room hospitable. All our wall decorations in that room would never stay up. We tried every method possible without damaging the walls. Our new lights would pop overnight, leaving glass in the bath mats. We had the electricals checked several times, but got no explanation as to why every bulb except the ceiling fixture, which was original to the house, would burst. Why this only happened in the bathroom, why every decoration was somehow removed by morning, or why it smelled overwhelmingly of juniper when both of us absolutely hated the scent. Ollie the cat was a normal cat before he and Megan moved in. At Megan's last apartment, I'd play with Ollie and have to shoo him off any project I was working on. But when we moved, he was different, and blamed it on him being moved into this new environment. But he never got better. He would stay in Megan's room, refuse to play or be pet. He was no longer interested in jumping on my papers. That cat was terrified. In particular, he was terrified of that bathroom, that stupid, juniper-smelling bathroom. Then one day, Megan told me that Ollie had a new behavior. He watched my door all night long, every night, no matter if my door was open or closed. He watched, and he watched intently. He was tracking something. We called an exterminator. The guy couldn't find a spider or any trace of any kind of vermin. Of course, we had put traps in the basement and sprayed just for good measure. One night, I was alone in the house, and it clicked. Ollie, the smell, why some decor was carefully removed and other trashed. I felt stupid. The house was over 100 years old. We had a spirit in our restaurant. See, gin used to be a very popular drink, especially for women. In days before safe procedures, it was called Mother's Ruin. I gathered my courage and sat just outside the bathroom. Ollie hid under Megan's bed and began crying. I concentrated, and a picture began to form. She was very willowy. She liked blues and whites, had dark hair, and she was very done up, and always topped with a hat. She had a secret lover. He left her, but not before giving her something that would ruin her. She was desperate, young, unmarried, laid down in the tub and started to drink. She rid herself of the unwanted burden, but in doing so, bled quietly to death in that tub. She was interested in me because I knew she was in that house with us. That bathroom was her mausoleum, and she wanted it pristine. She didn't like the modern lights, decorations, nor air fresheners, and would stand in my doorway at night, frantically trying to get my attention, wanting someone to acknowledge her. So I made compromises with her. I'd talk to her when I was in the room, if she'd no longer peek in my door at night. During daylight hours, she was welcome to follow me around, but she needed to leave the cat alone. And finally, I would leave decorations stacked by the tub for her approval. Although she didn't like, she would move away from the tub, so we could not use them. She liked our photos from a project about crumbling old structures. She never did make peace with the cat. and when I was ready to move out, she turned that juniper up full blast next to my pillow for a week. She was spoiled in life and lonely in death. I tried to persuade her that better things awaited her, but she was very stubborn about her bathroom. Who would keep nice things? Who would watch over the area she saw as a grave marker? I told her it wasn't even the same tub, and she knocked a photo off the wall. I know my friend has since moved on, and someone else lives there now. I just hope whoever lives there has a lot of patience, because the lady in the bath isn't going anywhere. From ages 13 to 16, I lived in a rural house with my mum. She worked late each night, and my brother would go to his girlfriend's house after school, so I would take the bus home, and it would drop me off at my house. I would do chores as soon as I got home so that I could play my video games or make my clay sculptures. I was alone in the house aside from a small dog, almost every weekday until around 7. I was washing dishes one afternoon, and I heard footsteps coming up from the basement, which was adjacent to the kitchen. There was a signature sound the stairs made because of the plastic tread that was either glued or nailed to them. It was a little creaky, gritty, plastic tapping sound, so I don't think it could have been the house settling. The sound grew louder behind me, as if someone was coming up the stairs. The footstep sounds were about to reach the top of the stairs, but I couldn't bring myself to look at the doorway to go to the stairs. I dropped the dish in the sink, grabbed the dog and ran outside and waited in the gravel driveway until my mum came home from work. This wasn't the only thing that happened. We had a makeshift family room in the basement, and we would watch movies in the basement and could hear footsteps in my brother's old room, like heavy boots or something walking around upstairs. Could it have been the house settling? But it terrified all of us. I recall one specific occasion where we had a couple of friends over and we rented some movies. When we had guests over, we would gather in the proper living room upstairs next to the kitchen. We were switching between DVDs when we heard a whistling tune coming from the basement. My mother and I both heard it and looked at each other, and we asked our guests if they heard it. Our guests heard nothing, and I went to investigate, because I felt safer with other people in the house. I checked the TV in the basement. It was off. Nothing was out of place, no signs where it could have come from. It could have been the pipes or the water heater, but I never heard it creak or whistle, or anything like that before or after. Just as my brother was getting ready to leave for the military, my grandma stayed with us for a week to see him off. She took my brother's room after he left, and she kept hearing someone pound on the door in the middle of the night. My mum told me she heard the same pounding on her door as well. I had an attic bedroom, so I never heard it. I called my mum asking her details, and she said there were lots of crazy things that happened. She recalled that when my grandma was cooking dinner in the kitchen by herself, a glass was thrown at her, and it busted on the wall next to her. My grandma insisted she didn't break the glass, and was offended that we thought she broke it somehow. One night not long after, I had a dream that was weird. In the dream I woke up in my bed because there was something scraping against the window that was right next to my headboard. I got out of bed and looked out the window, and saw the tree branch scraping against it. I looked at the tree and there was a glowing face staring back at me. My impression from this was someone was hanging from the tree. Then I woke up again in real life. I told my mum about the dream and we went on with our lives. About a week or so later, I was jumping on our trampoline outside, and my mum and her boyfriend were making hot dogs on the grill. Our landlord was mowing the grass, and his riding mower got stuck in a dip or hole in the ground on the side of the house outside my window. My mum's boyfriend said to give him a hand getting the mower out, because he was an older fella. I helped him out and then I asked him, why is there a hole in the ground right there? He said that that's where a tree used to be, but he had removed it because it kept scraping against the side of the house. My mum heard the conversation, and she and I both went kind of pale. The landlord finished up, and we all went on about our day. It was spooky, We moved to another town when I was 16 for unrelated reasons. I tried to look at these occurrences with doubt and criticism, but I still can't wrap my head around what was going on in that house all those years later. It was last year around summer when this happened. My sister and I were in the same bed, and we had one of our windows slightly open because it was very hot in the night. I remember it being about 1:30 in the morning. I was awake and getting a drink from my bedside table when I heard it, scratching at my door. At first I thought it was my mother or father, because they tend to say goodnight to us, but then I realized they were both in bed. So I naturally panicked, and while I panicked, the scratching continued louder and louder. It sounded like long fingernails being dragged on the wooden door, and it got deeper, then louder, until it just stopped. Again last year my sister was in my bed, and for context I sleep with a nightlight as I'm terrified of the dark. My bathroom is directly in front of my bedroom door across the landing, so I wake up around 2 in the morning and I need to go to the toilet. I make my way across the landing and leave the toilet light off because my nightlight was barely lighting the room. I sit on the toilet when I see it. A blank face peeking out of the door looking at me. It had no eyes, no mouth, but I could see a nose and short hair. It was just watching me go to the toilet. I sprinted out, woke my sister, and tried to show her the entity, but when I brought her, it was gone. It still freaks me out to this day. I was living with a family I was close to after leaving my bad home at 18. They always joked about one specific hallway being haunted by a ghost they affectionately called Jerry. One day I had to go down the hall and felt something from behind. Ran, and looked back when I got to the end of the hall and said, "Go away, Jerry." A few days later I come out of my bedroom that's at the top of a 13-step hardwood flight of stairs. I'm not wearing socks, I'm not dizzy, and I feel fine. All of a sudden something pushes my back hard, and I don't just fall down the stairs, I fly down them. Flip over the side railing, crash full force to the ground and slide on my back and hit my head on the bedroom door that's at the bottom right of the stairs. It gave me a slight concussion, and everyone in the house emerged and asked what happened, and how did it happen, because the only way I could have fallen the way I did is if I was shoved from behind, and there was no one upstairs with me at the time. I used to work in a haunted courthouse. It was built in the 1920s. The 4th floor was our first jail. A man tried to escape to the roofing after doing some digging and fell to his death from the roof. He straddled a heat/air pipe and chiseled his way to the roof, and I feel that he's the ghost that lingers around this place. The 4th floor is extremely large. The courthouse is a crowded space. However, we do not use the 4th floor for anything for the public, and the clerks that go up there are usually only up for a max of 30 minutes. Their records only take up about 1/20th of the real space available, when, as a courthouse, we are lacking space. I am new to this county. They have a tradition of always shutting and locking the old, solitary confinement box that still has padded walls, the only cell left, not destroyed, and I'm not sure why. I was allowed up by a clerk based off my curiosity. I asked why lock it, when all it has is used paint cans, and they said it's safest to. I went up with a county clerk who informed me until recently all the 4th floor was cells. Then they put in drywall and doors at the entrances. Note, to access the 4th floor itself is behind 2 heavily padlocked doors from both sides. She warned me after I was trying all the doors, being the tourist that I am, that I should not touch the far left door. When I asked why, she said once she was up there, and she heard heavy scratching from the other side and breathing, like someone was still trying to dig through the door. She told me she got another clerk still employed, and she brought it up and they both heard it. That no one likes to be up there for longer than half an hour. No one can access the room without a key, as both sides require it. Later that day, as I'm an attorney, I told District Court, which are separate offices, of the tour, and they told me that it was interesting and asked if I felt okay. I asked why, and the clerk then shared with me that she hired a woman to transfer the paper to electronic, and she had an issue up there. I asked what. She said she was up there working when she heard and saw the far left door handle being violently tried to open, which is both locked on both sides, and the door banging. The clerk went up to the 4th floor with her, and she was explaining that it was in her imagination and nothing was wrong. She was just imagining things due to the hours in a windowless room and peopleless level. That is when the door started banging harder, and the door handle started to open even more. They both fled. She did not know the door I knew. I did not know about the incident reported, but both the same door. There are a lot more stories, but at this point, I don't want a demon or ghost to attach itself to me. I now understand why I ask for an old file from the 4th floor. They look at me as if I'd just punched them. The clerk of District County reported to me when she was at the county attorney's head secretary before that they installed the double doors and always locked the solitary confinement. She and others used to see things late at night when she would come up to type up warrants. It seems our county has contained the issue. Maybe nothing, maybe something. I won't go back there for $1 million. I felt a little awkward and excited when I was up there. I'm an urban explorer and have been in sewer tunnels, etc., and really felt weirded out. They put up drywall around a bunch of old cells and added doors to the cells. I didn't know that when I was trying all the doors, before I got to the door far on the left, and the clerk told me not to touch it. As a child at the age of 4 in the late 60s, we lived in a brand new house. Next to it was a small footpath, and then a wild overgrown field, then a main road, and then the castle that was built in the 14th century. Hilton Castle specifically. At that age I had absolutely no concept of what a ghost was. My father used to check on us, my brother and I, to see if we were okay once we'd gone to bed. One night, I was awoken by a tapping on my shoulder, and was facing the wall when this happened. I ignored it firstly. Then the tapping began again and I felt it more rapid. I thought it might be my dad, and I said that I was okay, but the tapping didn't stop, so I turned around. What I see has stuck with me since. There was a boy, with a thin, pale face with mousy straight hair that looked like a bob. My first thought was, "Who are you?" But with him being so close to my face, his eyes stood out. I can understand why ghosts are depicted and are seen as having no eyes, but he did. Yet they were a thin veil. It reminds me of what a bubble does just before bursting. You could see through his eyes, and this absolutely terrified me, in which I shot under the blankets, out of the other end of my bed. I went screaming into my parents' bedroom and screaming that there was someone there. Odd things at the house happened now and then. My older brother once saw a soldier in the bedroom door. He woke me up when this happened and I sat on the bed to see. What I saw was a brief silhouette at the door, looking at it, as if it were taking a swipe at the bedroom light switch with a sword. We were both frozen until it disappeared. My older brother thought it was a medieval soldier, but by the shape of its head, which looked like a helmet. Sometime later, my uncle, who was coming to the house to babysat us, thought he saw a man in medieval fancy dress coming towards him, in which my uncle said, "Hello," but was utterly freaked out when he saw this person walk through the wall of the house. He said he was terrified by it. Sometime later, when I was older, I heard the story of the ghost that haunts the castle, the called Lad of Hilton. After reading the tragic story of Lad, I did wonder if he had visited other children at night, and I wish I had just asked him what he wanted. I heard lots of people have seen him through the years, and hope he's at peace now. Not me or my brother has any knowledge or history in any sense, nor my uncle has no interest in history. And this is all key to understand what we'd seen. My family was helping a family friend find good houses to settle down in. He came from China and was new to the area we lived in, so we attempted to help him find a place. We came across this open house and went inside. The real estate agent knew my mother from previous business partnerships, so he told us to just lock up when we leave. We were walking inside for a while, and there was suddenly an echo upstairs, like those creaking noises you hear when someone steps on a wooden floor that's not well placed. We thought someone was up there, but we were the only 5 people in the house, and the agent just came from the upstairs before telling us to lock up later. We ignored it at first, until the creaking noise went on for several seconds, and no one wanted to go and check it out. We were all kind of scared, since you had to go upstairs to turn on the lights and literally no one wanted to go up, even as a clump. After we left the house, my mum called the selling agent, and he told her that other people have heard these noises in the house, on the first story, as the second story is where the noises come from. That selling agent later said that there was a recent death by suicide on the second floor, which brought me chills. We never went back to that house or general area. Not sure if ghosts are real, but something was definitely making a noise up there. Maybe the house was just old and people walking inside would make the noise, but it didn't explain how the sound was coming from upstairs when we were all down. I live in a small country town in the Irish Midlands. I went to a secondary school about 20 miles away from home, in the main town of the county I live in, so naturally I made a lot of friends that side of the county and hung out there as I got older. Fast forward after finishing school for good. In my late teens I used to go out at the weekends and hang out with my mates and get drunk. We would mostly go to any metal gigs that were in pubs and such, as that was the scene we were into. There was one bar that we used to frequent quite a bit that was located in the cellar of an old orphanage that was renovated into apartments some time ago. Sadly, there was a tragic history. An incident that happened in the orphanage in the early 1940s, which saw a fire break out and the loss of more than 30 lives, all of them young girls. The reason that the orphans were not evacuated from the fire was because the nuns didn't think it decent for the girls to be seen in their nightgowns, so they were locked inside as members of the public tried to put out the fire. The poor children perished. The nuns survived. So I know one of the guys who worked in this cellar bar, and one night he told me that in the back cooler room where they kept their beer kegs, he and other staff could sometimes smell smoke and feel a bit dizzy, even though there was no fire or smoke to be seen. He even had an electrician and firefighter friend come in to check it out, along with the premises owner, but there was no fault in electronics or carbon monoxide to be found. This did only happen every now and again, but he found it quite eerie that this part of the cellar bar happened to once be the orphanage basement laundry room from which the tragic fire started some 60+ years earlier. Another thing I feel I should add to this story, and something that I experienced for myself, is a known fact that echoes of screams can be heard at night from inside the apartment rooms. Remember, the upper stories of the orphanage were renovated into accommodation. A few years ago I was staying with a different friend who lived in one of the apartments, and I was sleeping on his couch during the early hours. I swear to God I started to hear faint screaming and shouting in my sleep, but I had some weird filter to it, as if the noise was coming from a TV or radio outside in the hallway. I was pretty stoned, so I opened my eyes and lay there, to see if I could hear it again, but to no avail. Now, at that stage I obviously knew about the strange smoky smells from the cellar bar, but I had no idea about people hearing any screams, and so I passed no remarks on it. The next day I told my friend what I thought I heard and he confirmed it for me. He said that although he never heard any screams from his apartment, he had heard it only once from his neighbor's room, and that it seemed to be coming from either the hallway or outside in the back courtyard. Hearing this made me sad, and got me thinking about the girls. I didn't mention any names of places out of respect, but details of the orphanage fire can quite easily be found on the internet, and only one of many terrible things that the Irish Catholic Church has gotten away with in the past. Throughout my life, I've had a number of spooky experiences. The first was when I was 12. I saw an old lady in 1800s attire, blue dress, blue bonnet, knitting something while crying. I stuck my head under the covers and looked again, and suddenly she was gone. Fast forward 12 years, and I was staying at my friend's house that he had inherited from his grandparents who died inside it the year prior. This was about 5 months of sobriety for me. The first encounter in that house about the second day I was there, I was awoken by what sounded like a loud, open-handed smack on the closet door which jolted me awake, then focused on controlling my heart rate. As cliché as it sounds, it seemed I would occasionally hear whispers, but I could never make out the words precisely. Just like in scary movies, but I always brushed it off. The second encounter inside my friend's house was when I was taking a shower with music on loud. I rinsed, turned the water off, opened the curtain, and right as I was grabbing my towel, the fire alarm went off for 10 seconds, stopped, went off again for a whole minute before stopping, and I figured it was the spirit messing with me, so I turned the music down and went about my day. The third encounter was when I was sleeping in my room. I had a pretty big pile of pocket change on my dresser at the time, and woke up to what sounded like someone running their hand through the change, making the loud pitch that US currency does. Again, I immediately started focusing on controlling my heart rate. 20 seconds later, I felt what seemed like 2 fingers run down my thigh. I tripped out so hard but eventually fell back asleep. The third encounter was when I started dating this girl that I knew I shouldn't have been, but for some reason I liked to torture myself. I was already thinking about breaking it off with her at this point. While we were laying in bed, literally, as I was thinking of breaking it off with her, I heard a whisper that I could make out the word break in it, about 6 other words long. As I was trying to form sentences around the whisper, I just heard there was a tapping at my bedroom window, 2 sets of 5 taps. After the second set, I asked her if she heard the tapping, and she said yes. Then it stopped. I broke up with her the next day. My fourth encounter. I had broken up with her the day before, while I was in my room, and I was listening to music and writing my thoughts down on a piece of paper, when I heard what sounded like an old man yell my name from out loud from the hallway. So I shouted back, "Yo!" thinking perhaps it was my friend, and got no response. My friend was smoking his bong inside his bathroom in his room, and told him what I had just heard. After I told him, I could feel what felt like electricity spiking through my brain. It just felt tingly, but it was tingling for the most part in the back, or the cerebellum. I started to trip a little, so went to sit on the front porch with my friend and came with. As we were chilling there, a 3-legged cat that would sometimes come around came directly to me, which it never did, and sat underneath a chair. It stayed under my chair until it left, which then I realized my brain was feeling normal. I moved out shortly after into an apartment by myself. I ended up getting back with the girl I was with during this, and she ended up dying in my apartment on Christmas morning. And to those of you wondering, the thing that my ex regrettably died from was an overdose. I'm still convinced it was a positive ghost that wanted to help in some way. He ended up selling the house to his cousin and cousin's wife. About a year ago, I asked if anything weird had been happening in the house, and his wife said that she had heard sounds like children's laughter, and sometimes tapping. We both agreed that it didn't feel like a negative energy. I'm convinced it's one of his grandparents, which are also my distant relatives. I want to learn more and get involved with others dealing with spiritual entities, for I feel I'm more sensitive than perhaps your average person. When I was 6, my sister and my mother were all laying on my mum's bed, as my dad was away for work. We were watching a movie on the TV in the bedroom. My sister and mother were asleep, and I had just started dozing off when I heard the cat in the kitchen hissing, then running down the hallway. As soon as we got into the room, our dog, a very large, brindled boxer, jumped out of bed and went straight to the door and started growling down the hallway. And it's a very long hallway with 20-foot ceilings. This woke both my mum and sister up. My mum kept telling the dog to be quiet when she heard the candle slide across the counter in the kitchen and shattered to the floor. My mum sat straight up and my sister and I laid there frozen in fear. My mum got up and went to the door. The dog was right next to her, hair standing up. Then the kitchen faucet was turned on full blast. My mum was terrified and so were we. She hit the light switch in the hallway and walked out about halfway down. My sister and I jumped out of bed and clung behind her. When we get to the kitchen, the light was on, water was running and the handle was sitting on the counter perfectly fine. No doors were unlocked, and we went through the entire house making sure nothing was out of place or anyone there. We can all recall this memory very vividly. So many creepy and scary things happened in that house. That's just one. We were there from 96 to 01 and ended up moving due to horribly bad luck and fear of any of us being alone. We moved from a small, cozy home to a much larger, old Victorian terraced house in a busy part of the city. The house had been an old shop and had a separate new annex that had been built along the side of it. This house was perfect, as we had moved to accommodate my nan who needed care around the clock, but didn't want to move into a nursing home. The house was huge, with a long, tree-lined garden. The newer parts were light and airy, but the oldest parts of the building were, despite a lot of renovation, still quite dark and creepy. It wasn't ideal, as the area wasn't great, but my parents needed somewhere quickly, and it was the best available. Mum worked long hours in a sales job, and Dad schooled myself and my sister from home. This meant we could also help care for Nan when Mum wasn't around. The 5 or so years that we lived there were very stressful to say the least, with money worries and health worries for our Nan, who sadly had dementia. I won't go into huge detail, but I just wanted to paint that picture for you. As mentioned before, my parents were heavily into the spiritual and supernatural, but more in an investigative way. Dad had previously worked as a medium, but had distanced himself from the scene due to not taking people seriously anymore, and feeling a bit disillusioned with the whole thing. My sister, being a bit of a princess, had bagged the largest bedroom for herself when we moved. It also happened to be part of the new build. I was left with a smaller, dark room at the top of the stairs. I didn't mind much, as we previously had to share. It was just nice to have my own space. The bedrooms were connected via a long, rather narrow and gloomy landing, which had a bathroom in the middle. My sister's bedroom was right at the end, as it was above the new kitchen and annex. The whole upstairs, apart from the new end bedroom, had a really odd feel to it, like 3 cats would refuse to cross the landing. And when we got a dog, she would stand at the top of the stairs and growl, refusing to come into my bedroom. My room was typically old-fashioned, with a large bricked-up fireplace and dated floral wallpaper. The first night I slept there, I was nervous for no good reason, and didn't sleep well the whole night. I put this down to it being a new space, but honestly, the feeling never really left during my time there. This part of my life was not great. I was dealing with being a teenager and feeling lonely due to being home educated and not having any friends. There was also the stress of helping look after Nan, who needed total care. And the added bonus of being bullied by the local kids. I struggled with extreme depression and began to have really dark and negative thoughts towards myself. I'm not blaming the house for this, but it certainly seemed to amplify the atmosphere somehow. This might sound weird, but I believe that whatever was there fed off my negativity and intensified the activity. The first thing that happened was small doors opening and closing, things going missing for no reason and then turning up in random places, knockings and tappings on the wall. Dad tried not to scare us by talking about it, but he later said he always felt a pressure in that house and knew there was at least one entity there. I think the first big thing for me was seeing a large black triangle of smoke just drift across the front room one day. I had been sitting reading on the sofa when I looked up and saw this thing, maybe 4 foot tall, made of thick black smoke, slowly hover across the room and disappear into the wall. The whole experience lasted around 20 seconds, and my brain didn't really properly process it. The shape had been a perfect triangle. No one believed me when I told them, and I can't quite explain it still. Next came large orbs of light that would zip across the room, and more often than not, seemingly go up to the stairs and disappear. This was not only seen by Mum, blamed car headlights, but we would usually have the heavy curtains drawn and no other real sources of moving light. The orbs would vary in size, more often than not being around the size of a closed fist. This was followed by tapping and knockings on the wall as they appeared and then disappeared up the staircase. Whatever was there liked to move things around. Mum and Dad had to collect ornaments, and we had a few around the TV. One being this cool little stone statue of a hooded lady with a small crystal ball in her lap. One day, Dad and I were playing computer games when the stone statue suddenly lifted, maybe 20 centimeters off the unit, and then slammed back down again with enough force to make a loud bang. That was the beginning of the more intense activity. I began to hear my name being called. This would only happen when I was downstairs in the dining room that was linked to the staircase upstairs. I would hear a voice, sometimes female, sometimes male, calling me by name, seemingly from upstairs. It freaked me out, but I didn't want to say anything to my parents as they were stressed enough at this point, without me adding disembodied voices to their list. During this time, my depression intensified, and I began harming myself and having very bleak suicidal thoughts. In the night, I would see dark shapes in my bedroom and flashing lights, but I was just too numb to care anymore. I would disregard them. I had a small cat that used to come into my bedroom, as he hated the dog, and would come in through my window on a night to get some peace. Every night at 3 a.m. without fail, he would leap from my bed and scramble to get out of the window again. I put this down as being a weird cat thing, but at 3 a.m. the atmosphere in my room would also change, becoming much darker. This would be when I saw shadows and lights. I told no one this, thinking that possibly it was all in my head. One night, Mum was out working, and I was awake, keeping an ear out just in case my Nam woke up and she needed help, as she frequently got confused and asked for a cup of tea late into the night. I suddenly heard a blast of noise, like a loud radio, and then doors slamming, followed by the sound of my sister screaming in terror. She ran into my room beside herself with fear. Once she had calmed down, she explained that her radio had suddenly turned itself on at full volume, and at the same time, all of her windows and doors had opened fully. Indeed, when I went to investigate, her windows were all open, and the radio was blasting static through the speakers. She slept in with me that night, and then told me the following day that she would rather sleep in her room after all than just stay in mine again. It's just creepy, she told me. All of this was weird. But then came the time that I physically saw what I think was an apparition. I haven't talked about the upstairs bathroom yet. It was seemingly normal, but definitely had the strangest vibe. I didn't even like going in there, as it felt like someone was watching. But it was the nearest bathroom to me, and the only one with a shower, so I used it reluctantly. One day I was brushing my teeth at the sink, when I looked up and saw in the mirror behind me a woman in a white dressing gown. She was around 30, with long, blonde hair and dark circles under her eyes. She stood directly behind me, and was staring at my reflection with a very blank and heavy gaze. I had never seen her before in my life. She looked completely real, but I got such a feeling of wrongness and fear that I just dropped the toothbrush and ran. Of course, no one else had been visiting, and the rest of my family were downstairs. It shook me up for so much, I refused to visit that bathroom for a while, and would wash my hair in the kitchen sink instead of showering. I told no one about her, but tried to draw her from memory in a sketchbook. I'm a pretty good artist, but the picture that I drew was technically flawless, and not something that a 14-year-old girl should be able to produce. It scared me so much that I burnt the picture straight away and tried to forget about it. One day, during the worst bit of my depression, I was reading in the dining room. My dad had laid down the sofa. What? My dad had lied down for a bit on the sofa in the next room, and I assumed he was asleep. My parents were also super stressed at the time, and he was probably really tired or run down. After a while, he walked into the dining room and gave me a strange look. Now bear in mind that he used to work and make a living from being a medium for this next bit. He asked me who had been visiting my room in the night. Confused, I replied that no one had. He went blank for a second, kind of switched off, and then said, No, there's a woman, and you've been seeing stuff in your room. Of course I knew exactly what he meant, but not wanting my folks to know, I still denied it. He went quiet again, and then told me that someone had told him about the woman, and that I had seen her, and that I was in danger of hurting myself and that she was feeding off me. All of this hit home, and I finally broke down and explained all of it, even the self-harm and suicide attempts. It was very traumatic, and I hated upsetting my parents, but it was what needed to happen. Later, my dad went up to cleanse my room. He didn't seem satisfied afterwards, and my parents renovated the summer house in the garden to be my new bedroom. It was cold in the winter, but I instantly felt lighter and better in there. There was no longer that constant dread. Towards the end of our time there, we learnt a little about the previous owners from an old neighbour. I have no idea if any of this is true, as I never found proof, but I certainly need to include it. Apparently in the late 90s, a family had lived in the old shop. Something was wrong with the older daughter, who had mental health issues, and she sadly ended up taking her own life in the city park one night. I work as a care assistant for elderly individuals in rural areas of England. There is one house that we used to go to that I jokingly called the murder house, because it looked like something you'd see in a movie dealing with mysterious murders. Not the most affectionate name, but it was all in all a jest, and the lady I cared for certainly thought it was funny. She lived in a 10-bedroom farmhouse surrounded by empty barns and cellars. If it was windy, there was a shed in the back garden that would creak, and it wasn't fun to be alone in at night. But the lady was a dream, super nice, loved to banter, and was genuinely so kind. She would tell me stories about her husband, and how he was perfect and lovely, and she missed him so much, as he had died 7 years prior from cancer. She had pictures of him all around the house. Other carers that I worked with had noted some experiences at the house. During the daytime, one girl was making the bed and glanced out the window to see a man gardening that didn't look like the usual gardener. She went to our client and explained, "Oh, Sarah, you got a new gardener," and proceeded to describe the man she saw. Sarah would smile and say, "That's my husband. I bought him that jacket 30 years ago, and he used to wear it for gardening." She seemed to gain comfort from the thought of him being there, which was precious. I had never had an experience at the house until 5 months of going to see her. I wasn't on shift, but had come in with my co-worker who had her call, so I sat in the chair across from her bed and spoke with her. Behind the chair was nothing but wall, and beside me on the left was a large chest, and to my right a bookcase. As I was speaking, I felt a calming presence over me, and I felt like my co-worker had re-entered the room and had walked behind my chair and was standing to my right. This was odd, but I turned to include her in the conversation. She wasn't there. Confused, I looked back, and Sarah shrugged, saying I must have just been hearing things. It was weird, and to this day I still get chills thinking about it. We rented a large house. Each evening my wife and I would take our daughter upstairs for a bath and put her to bed. I stayed downstairs, spending a couple of hours on my laptop before going upstairs myself. For 3 years nothing unusual happened. Then one November evening when my wife and daughter had retired upstairs and I was on the laptop, the room went icy cold and I began to shiver. I had a sensation that someone was standing right behind me, staring straight at the back of my head. For several minutes, I struggled to turn and looked behind me, but I was paralyzed. It remained like this for a few minutes, and then the temperature suddenly returned to normal and I could move. There was nothing behind me. I didn't mention anything to my wife about my experience. The same events then occurred for the next 3 evenings. Still, I said nothing. On the 4th evening, after my wife had gone upstairs, instead of opening up my laptop, I sat on the sofa watching TV from this position. And from this position I could view the entire living room. After a few moments, I became aware that there was a translucent figure of a young girl, aged around 6 or 7, with long blonde hair and dressed in night clothes. At first I thought it was my daughter, but she has dark brown hair. The figure stood looking into the room for several minutes, then turned and walked down the hallway and vanished into the kitchen. The atmosphere was one of calm. I got up and followed her into the kitchen, but she had gone. I decided to go to bed, and still didn't say anything to my wife for fear of upsetting her. The next evening I was on the sofa, and once again the little girl appeared and stood silently just looking into the room. And once again she turned, walked down the hall and vanished. When I woke up the next morning I decided I had to tell my wife, and began by saying that there was something I needed to talk to her about. Without any further prompting, she said to me, "Was it about the little girl?" Had she seen her too? Yes, often. I told her she could stay as long as she didn't cause a nuisance. I said that I thought her appearances were going to increase for some reason. My wife, who is quite religious, said she thought she would say some prayers to tell the little girl it would be okay for her to leave us. And after this, we never saw her again. There was also a strange ending to this story. About 6 months later, my work contract finished, and we were moving away from this house. I called the landlord, and he came over as we were leaving to settle up the paperwork and so forth. During our conversation with the landlord, he mentioned that we were his longest renters, and that most people left after a few months. I joked that it might be because his house was haunted, and related our story. The landlord then told us he had originally designed and built this house for his young family, but when their youngest daughter was 6, she had woken up one night and climbed over the stair railing and fallen to her death onto the stone floor below. The family was so distraught, they moved out and rented their home rather than selling it. The landlord said his wife had never set foot in the house for the next 15 years. Right up until her death previous November. I reminded my wife that it was November when we first began seeing the little girl, and we now believed she had come in search of her mother. We felt that after saying prayers we helped them to meet up and pass over to the other side. Before these events occurred to us, I was highly skeptical about the paranormal. My position was, show me proof. When my wife corroborated that I had seen and described exactly the same little girl, I was very careful not to prompt her in any way or try to influence her story. The complete similarities could not be explained by coincidence. Then when the landlord told us about his daughter, again without any hinting from us, it was yet another level of proof for me. 2 things stand out for me in this experience. One is that not only did I visually see the little girl, but I also was aware of her from some other internal sense that I'd never noticed before or experienced since. I think maybe we have a deeper unconscious feeling with which we can experience the paranormal. The second thing of interest was that despite being in the presence of an unworldly experience, it was not the slightest bit terrifying. In fact, the sense was of great calmness. I have to rethink my beliefs as a result of these experiences. My husband does not believe in the paranormal. Me, on the other hand, does, to the point of knocking on walls to get the ghosts to come out and play. One evening I went out quickly to pick up some dinner for me and my husband before a friend came over. While I was at the place and ordering, they didn't have what he wanted, so I called him. He answered the phone and sounded off. He asked me to come home quick because something happened. I go into panic mode and I could hear the distress in his voice. After some badgering, I made him tell me what happened. I have a little shadow box with a small porcelain bisque doll mounted in it called Frozen Charlotte. There is a creepy story behind the dolls, and I bought it for the creep factor. I firmly believe the doll and shadow box are not haunted. Apparently, as my husband was chilling in the living room waiting for me, the shadow box launched at him from the small hallway and the way where it was hung into the living room where he was sitting. It was a very far distance for it to travel. He got really spooked and went outside to have a cigarette when I called. I was a little creeped out, but more curious and envious that he got to have the ghost throw something at his head, and I didn't. I got our food and headed home. While I was on my way home, he was outside and our friend showed up. They both go into the house to see the kitchen was an absolute disaster. Every drawer was open, cabinets, and the trash that sits in front of one drawer was tipped over. The drawer in question is where I keep kitchen linens. It was open with all the towels, tablecloths, and placement mats strewn over the place. My husband said to our friend, "It wasn't like this earlier." So I come home and my friend is standing on our back stoop and is like, "Come inside and see." I was pretty shocked. The place was pretty messy, as my husband was freaked out. I put the food down and started cleaning, put the towels back into the bottom drawer and shoved the drawer closed. The drawer is super old and isn't on runners or anything, it won't close. I sigh and heave the thing out because I thought a towel or something got trapped behind it. I was right, but it wasn't a towel. It was a small plastic baggie, and inside it had a bit of paper and a string tied around it. I'd never seen this thing before, and was no idea what it was. So I open the baggie and untie the teeny tiny package and find some herbs. My friend almost gleefully says, "That is weed," and true enough I took a whiff and it was. The paper looked like a tea bag, as the string the whole thing package was wrapped up in, and it looked like a tea bag string. The amount of weed could have covered a nickel, so it wasn't much. We don't usually keep weed in the house, and if we do, it's usually in a joint. The conclusion I have is that this ghost was looking for the weed, because there's no other explanation for me. I don't believe my husband would stage this, as you can't fake his reaction. He was pale as a ghost and shaking terribly. Plus, as he was hanging up on the phone, my friend was coming up the driveway and saw him. I doubt there would have been enough time to stage the scene, as it were. We haven't had any other things happen like that, with the exception of the ghost that lives in the bathroom. But that is a story for another day. This story happened when I was around 11 years old, perhaps a little older. I had just moved into the room upstairs where my older sister used to live. I always read Donald Duck on the bed before going to sleep. One night I was reading and really had to pee. I left the Donald Duck magazine on my bed open with the pages down, as to know where I had it. I hadn't heard of a thing called bookmarks back then. So I went downstairs to do my business, and when I came back up the magazine was gone and nowhere to be seen. I checked under the bed, in my nightstand, nothing. It was pretty late and everyone else was asleep, as I was quite the night owl already back then, and I said screw it and just went to bed. The next morning when I went to the bathroom, the magazine was laying on a chest of drawers next to the toilet, open with the pages down. The thing is, my sister experienced a lot of weird stuff in that room. The volume on her sound system turning up and down, the sound system suddenly turning on the highest volume, CDs falling out of the shelves, and she never got a good night's sleep in that room ever. Neither did I, which is probably why I became a night owl now that I think about it. I also had just gotten a guitar for Christmas when I moved into that room. Could not play it well yet. My parents were divorced, and one weekend I was at my mum's house. Didn't bring my guitar, as I didn't want to ruin it anyway. That weekend, my dad and my stepmom were laying in bed, as their room was next to mine, when they heard guitar coming from my room. Like good guitar playing. They listened to it for a while until it stopped. It never happened again. No one else was in that house at the time either, as my younger sister and I always spent the weekends at each other's parents', and she was like 8, and my brother had moved out by then. I am from the United States, but my parents are from India, specifically the northern Indian state of Punjab. Before COVID, I would travel there frequently, as my parents wanted me and my siblings to spend time with my elderly grandparents. Punjab is, in my opinion, very beautiful. It's mostly farmlands, flat and green, so vast that it's hard to see where the farms end in certain areas, like a sea or an ocean. It's this beauty that motivates the farmer from the Punjab and other states to protest the Indian government's new agricultural laws, which will make living off agricultural work harder than it already is. But I digress. The summer of 2013, I was visiting my dad's parents. They lived by themselves in a large house which looked a bit like a castle, 3 stories high, though the top floors were pretty much abandoned, as my grandparents had a hard time with stairs. On the bottom floor were 4 bedrooms and a large storage room, which are very common in the Punjab. These are rooms that work like attics or basements, where old and extra things are kept. One unusual thing about the house, which isn't uncommon there, was windows inside it. This was to keep the house ventilated and mold out during the monsoon. The room I shared with my older brother was right next to the storage room and had 2 large windows that connected to it. My brother, who had lived in that house, said the house wasn't normal. He said that when the house was being built, some woman had done black magic on the ground, where she had sacrificed a dog in a ritual, and the remains of the dog were still under the floor in the storage room. I was fully creeped out but didn't want to admit it, though I remember feeling creeped out every time I would look out at the sealed window in our shared room with the storage room. My brother and I are essentially the same personality and butt heads all the time. I forget what we were arguing about. I was so frustrated that I went to the abandoned 2nd floor and just hung out there for a while. It was dusty and grey from old cement falling here and there. Like in the movies, old furniture was covered in white and now grey in cloth, making the whole floor look like a scene from Scooby-Doo. Maybe it was the story of black magic, or me being upset, but I felt like something was staring at me the whole time, like someone was standing right in front of me behind the grey dust and white cloth, but someone I couldn't see. My brain cells were telling me that someone should be there, though I couldn't see anyone. I freaked out a bit in my stubborn anger and decided to step out onto the balcony rather than go back down. It was a beautiful but stuffy afternoon, something I was enjoying until I saw little white twigs lining the balcony's rail. I looked closer to see that they weren't twigs but bones. Not human, of course, maybe bird or rat, but there were no rib cages or skulls, just arms and wings. I freaked out once again and saw ants clamoring around them. This reminded me of the story of the black magic dog ritual, and finally I broke and went back downstairs. To my chagrin, that wasn't the end of the creepy things for the night. My brother had decided to give me the room all to myself, out of the same stubborn anger I had. He knew I was afraid, but I wasn't going to let him get to me like that. So when it came to sleep, I closed the lights and tried to sleep. My head was towards the window of the storage room. True darkness does not come from a lack of light, but our mindset, and I began to get creeped out while in the darkness. So I put on my phone light and scanned the whole room, but didn't see anything. I felt the same eerie feeling I had upstairs, as if I was a few feet away from intelligent eyes watching me. I decided it was nothing, placing the lit phone near my head like a nightlight. I put on some music and faded to sleep. Sometime into sleep I awoke. My eyes just flipped open and I felt terrified, like my senses were going haywire. My phone's light was moving as a dark shape seemed to run around the room. It looked like a person, with long hair running around, screaming and singing, humming a weird tune. I couldn't really catch a good view of it, as it seemed its hair was all over my face. I tried reaching for my phone. It was still lit somewhere in the room. I couldn't see where though, only its dim light. I knew I wasn't having a night terror, as I could move my hands and arms. I just couldn't seem to find my phone, until I gathered my courage and lunged up and flicked on the light. There was nothing in the room. The room was as it was, except for my bed, where I had ripped out the bed sheet that had been tucked from the mattress. My phone was right there, near my pillow. Light still on. I don't know what it was that night, but I definitely think it was the summer heat and the negative feelings I had against my brother joining together to pick up a story and bother me. Though in recent years we have found out the land our house is built on was once a butcher shop and house. Way before, during the 1940s, when our village was an Afghan or Pathan village, they moved out during the partition, and my great-grandfather bought the land. My uncle says that there were large hooks for stringing up meat and large animals left behind. And down the street, where there are now shops, used to be a Muslim graveyard. My dad tells me he remembers the graves being dug up and moved somewhere when he was young. That street is apparently also known as a street where the witch lives, though I personally don't believe or disbelieve in these things. We also have a large metal basin which apparently was made from a downed Pakistani aircraft from one of the many wars the two nations have fought, though I doubt it has anything to do with this. My grandma and great-grandma and their dog moved into an old cabin. There were many stories she had about strange things that happened in the house. Sinks turning on in the middle of the night, noises of footsteps in the attic, motion sensor lights at night turning on when my great-grandma was asleep, with the dog in another room. Also, there were crosses carved above many of the doorways. When they moved in, my aunt helped with some painting and covering the crosses in the process. As they covered them, they heard noises coming from another part of the house. The next day, all the crosses were back. Coincidentally, my mum's boss's son just recently moved into the exact same house 15 years later, and she was telling my mum about her son's haunted house before ever being told that my grandma and great-grandma had actually lived there previously. I'm a 15-year-old female. 2 years ago, I was waking up to go to school one morning. My mum woke me up and then walked to the other side of my room to grab some clothes out my closet. I was tired, but I woke up pretty quick, though I didn't leave my bed since I was comfortable. I look over and then see an old man standing at the end of my bed. He was old and had a walker. Imagine one of those square ones with the tennis balls at the bottom, except it didn't have tennis balls, and then he started walking around the side of the bed towards me. I might have just been tired, but I wasn't scared at all, and I called out, "Hello?" My mum looked over and asked who I was talking to which I reply, "The old man." She gets confused, and so do I, because he's no longer there, and moments later we just stopped talking about it. The second story is by far the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced. One night I was staying up super late because I had recently gotten a telescope and my dad and I were going to set it up at midnight and look at the stars. I am in the playroom watching Harry Potter with all the lights off, except for maybe the kitchen light, which was in the room next to the one I was in. The front door was open, but we had a screen door that was shut. Everything's fine until suddenly something slams into the screen door and just stands there. I stare at it, unable to move, just scared out my mind. It was dark, but there was enough light where I would have been able to see it if it were an animal or something. But it wasn't. I couldn't see anything but the bulge in the screen. I knew it was tall, probably 4 to 6 feet, and it was just standing there. I couldn't see any eyes, but I knew it was watching me. And after what felt like an eternity but was probably mere minutes, it finally backed away and presumably ran. I was frozen in fear. I ran, screaming for my parents who were across the house from me. About a year or two later, I finally realized how dangerous that situation could have been, since the screen door wasn't locked. Whatever that thing was could have just come in and taken me, but it didn't. It elected to watch me and leave. This is my final story. I had just gotten out of the shower and was staring out the window in my room with my towel wrapped around me. On the other side of my room, I had a shelf thing that instead of shelves, it was just bars. I have this doll. It was like a music box that I got for my first birthday, and it was on one of the shelves, when suddenly it began playing. I walked over, and when I picked it up it just stops. But it shouldn't have been able to just play, because the wind-up thing at the bottom was stuck between 2 of the bars. It never happened again, but I avoided my room that night. There's one event that has always messed with me, and probably will until the day I die. I rented a room in a house that my friend had recently purchased after my mum moved in with a boyfriend, and I didn't want to live with him because he's a jackass. It was a decent little 2-bedroom, one on each side of the house. I had only been living there for a month or 2 and everything had been pretty chill. My father had died around January of that year, and my mum didn't want to keep his urn in her house or put it in storage. A little backstory. My dad was a bastard. I never really had a relationship with him and hadn't seen or heard from him during the last 6 years of his life until the cops knocked on the door in the middle of the night and told me he had overdosed. I was not surprised, and neither was anyone else. We all saw it coming. So we got him cremated and debated back and forth what to do with him, and nothing ever came of it. So anyway, I'm moving in, and I felt kind of guilty putting the urn in storage, so I just stuck it in the closet. Now onto the spooky stuff. I wake up in the middle of the night, which happens frequently, and have never really been a great sleeper, so this is nothing unusual. I'm sweating balls for no reason, and I check the clock. It's about 3:58 or so, and I'm thinking, damn, I'm never going to get back to sleep, and I'm a little pissed. So I'm just sitting there thinking what I should do for a minute when I hear a noise. It sounds like someone was trying the doorknob, but I know the door isn't locked. I trust my roommate completely, and I've never had any reason to lock my door besides. It's his house. So I call out, "Nick, you awake, dude?" and get no response. I notice the noise has stopped. I'm a little weirded out, but I do not leave the bed, just lay back down and try to sleep. As I'm laying there, I notice my closet door is open, and I was looking directly at my father's urn. I felt like I was being stared at or something, but I try not to think about it. I eventually fall asleep and get up around 10 a.m. As I come out of the room and into the kitchen, I see my roommate sitting on the couch, holding a gigantic kitchen knife, and he looks absolutely terrified. He looks at me like the devil himself just walked out of my room. He literally jumps off the couch and screams, "What's wrong with you? Are you trying to kill me? That was not funny." I'm all sorts of confused and trying to figure out what the hell he's talking about. Then he lays it on me. This is his account of what he heard the previous night. He wakes up at 4 a.m. to a blood-curdling scream, obviously craps himself and jumps out of bed terrified. Then silence. He creeps into the kitchen, down the hall from my room, and calls my name. "You right?" Nothing for a few seconds. Then another scream. He said it sounded like I was being murdered, grabs the kitchen knife and rungs at my door and bangs on it a few times. There is no response, so he tries the door. It's locked. Bangs on it again. Then there's a weird shuffling noise as if someone is dragging their feet across the hardwood floor. Sounds like someone straight up walked up to the door but didn't open it. He freaks out and doesn't know what to do. He just stands away from the door for a while, ready to stab. After a few minutes of this, he just backs away, staring at the door, and stays awake until daylight. So we collectively crap ourselves, as I turn white as we look at each other, when it dawns on us. We had both been awake at the same time, 4 a.m. Both of us called out each other's names and got no response. I didn't hear him, he didn't hear me. We couldn't hear each other through a crappy hollow wooden door. If someone was banging on my door, I would have been up in half a second. It was impossible for me to sleep through something like that. I heard no screams. It was possible that I was having a nightmare or something and screamed when I awoke, but there wasn't just one, there was two. I didn't hear either. The door was apparently locked, but it wasn't when I awoke. Why didn't he call the police? I'll never know. His family is Greek and very superstitious, so he had the local priest or whatever they call them bless the house. I'm not much of a believer in ghosts and stuff, but after a while I put the old man's ashes into storage, and nothing weird has happened before or since. We'd never found an explanation for this, other than maybe my dad's ghost came back to scare me. A few years ago, I moved from South Carolina to Georgia for family reasons to live with my cousin Ethan. The house had belonged to our grandmother my entire life, and I was very familiar with the place. The house was a 3-story townhome. If you don't know what a townhome is, it's a very thin house, but it's very tall and almost always connected to other townhomes, like a bunch of dominoes side by side. Or if you live in England, a terrace house. Ever since I was younger, I remember loving the home during the day. But at night, the eerie feeling of the home changed. The once well-lit stairwell became impossible to see through, and the open windows showed only darkness. It was also deathly silent. You almost never heard the neighbors, and while that might not sound like a good thing, it made you feel like you were the only person around for miles. While the house was creepy, I had never experienced anything remotely paranormal. Things had been relatively calm until 1 month after I had moved in permanently. Since the house was so eerie, my cousin and I usually elected to share a room. It felt more comfortable that we could have conversations until we fell asleep. One night we went to bed late, around 3 a.m., and Ethan got up to use the bathroom. He woke me up when he left, so I decided to do something to creep him out. I thought about hiding in the stairwell and jumping out at him when he came out, or pounding on the door to the bathroom since he thought I was still asleep. All of a sudden, the bedroom door opened again. The hallway was so dark I couldn't see him at all, but I heard him walk into our room. Then in the pitch black, I heard him shut our door, walk past me where I was sleeping, and lay down under his covers. I was kind of bummed he came back so soon because I wanted to scare him. So instead, I decided it would be creepy if I just stood up as fast as I could and speed walked out the room. Kind of lame, but we already thought the house was scary, so I thought it might get him. So I did it. I shot up out of bed as fast as possible and quickly ran out the room and shut the door behind me. I was outside our room and consumed in the darkness of the hallway, listening for his reaction. That's when I realized something awful. I was hearing noise, but it wasn't coming from the bedroom. It was coming from right behind me. I turned around and listened. There was someone in my bathroom. I was scared but also confused because Ethan was just in there, so I knocked. "Ethan, is that you?" "Yeah." This is when I came to the horrifying realization that someone else was in the room with me when I ran out. In the pitch black of the hallway, I backed away from the door and told Ethan to come out. I very quietly told him what happened, and we both decided that we had to check the room. We braced ourselves, and I slowly opened the door, expecting to see some terrifying figure in his bed. Our room had no ceiling light, so in order to adequately see I had to walk into the darkness of the room and turn on the floor lamp. After I mustered up the courage, I ran into the room and turned the lamp on. His bed was empty. We searched the room and under our beds but couldn't find anyone, and to this day it still baffles me because I know I was awake to hear everything that occurred. And to make it even creepier, we slept with the windows open that night. We were on the 3rd floor, but someone could have jumped to the thick divider between the house backyards if they wanted to. I made sure the doors are always locked from now on. I studied and lived in Edinburgh, and the apartment I lived in was very old. It had old, worn-down concrete steps, which spiraled around to each landing, and the only light came from a skylight 3 floors up. In the winter months, it was pitch black in this hallway. On one winter's night, I was returning from the local Tesco, and I was fumbling along the walls around the stairwell because it was pitch black. I lived on the 3rd floor, so it was an absolute pain in the arse and took ages. When something brushed past me, there was no sound at all, but I felt it. I never believed in ghosts before, but I couldn't explain this. Something definitely brushed past me and set me off balance. It completely freaked me out. Anyway, I made it to my flat eventually, and all was well, and I quickly forgot about the whole incident. 1 month later, I leave Edinburgh. I switch on the news one evening while eating my dinner, and had the biggest shock of my life. There was a dead body found in the flat directly opposite mine. Same hallway, 3 feet. Now you're probably thinking, no big deal, yeah? Dead bodies are found all the time. Well, that body lay in that flat for 5 years. The whole duration I lived there. Here's the really messed up part of the story. I lived in a different flat in Edinburgh before this all happened. I used to receive mail from the previous owners and landlord. Guess who the letters were addressed to? Yep, the name of the person found dead. I'll never forget the name for the rest of my life. Rest in peace, Isabella Purves. My parents' second house had some oddities in the first year or so after we moved in. All but one event happened to my mother. This one was the first to happen, which my dad also witnessed. That is, if you count hearing something as witnessing it. We had a shop vac, purchased atop a freestanding shelf in the laundry room. Now the laundry room was directly next to my parents' bedroom, in such a way that the washer and dryer were directly on the other side of the wall from their bed. Exactly how we had the washer, dryer and shelves arranged, I don't know, because shortly after this we took apart the shelves and stored them somewhere else for unrelated reasons. However, the shop vac was atop it, and the washing machine was somewhere nearby. My mother usually keeps the lid to the washing machine open at night to let it air out. My parents heard this crash one night as they were falling asleep. It sounded like it was in the laundry room, so they went to check it out. The shop vac had somehow managed to land in the washing machine. Now it was positioned on the shelf in such a way there was no way for it to be able to fall off, and everything was pretty stable. There was no angle or anything that would cause it to slide off, and I know this because they tested it and tried to place it on the shelf in such a way that it would become unstable, but that never happened. This was the only poltergeist activity to occur. My mother often sleeps in the living room couch. The living room of the house is situated in such a way that my bedroom and the spare room are off on one wall, and the doorway to the rest of the house, including the bathroom, is on the other. One night, my mother heard me walking across the living room, presumably to go to the bathroom, except that I wasn't walking across the room, but it sounded like I was going in circles around the rocking chair that's near the entrance to the hallway. My mother called my name, asking what I was doing. She got no answer. She kept calling my name, becoming increasingly frustrated with me because I didn't say anything. Eventually, she turned on the light. Nothing was there. She checked on me, and I was asleep. On another occasion, my mother felt footsteps behind the couch. The couch wasn't up against the wall, and there was a walkable-sized area between the back of the couch and the front window. The thing is, she didn't hear the footsteps, only felt the weight of some of the pacing back and forth. She said, "Can you stop it? I'm trying to sleep." And the footsteps stopped. My grandma called one day and said, "Did you call me a minute ago?" My mum hadn't. Grandma then continued to explain how she'd just gotten a call from us, and when she answered, no one was on the other end of the line. However, she could hear everything that was happening in the house. My dad was watching TV, my mother was vacuuming the rug, and both of my parents were arguing over something at the same time. She could also hear me playing whatever computer game I was into at the time, probably Warcraft 3. On top of all this, she said she heard a sound that sounded like paper being folded right next to the phone. Now, I've delved pretty deep into the creepy, spooky Ask Reddit collection, and I've seen other stories of old phone calls that involve fabric folding noises happening in the foreground. The strangest part of this is that it just happened to occur on the exact same day that my mother's aunt died. This next story is the only one to take place within the last few years of my family living there, instead of the first. I had woken up before, though I cannot say how many times, by the voice of a little girl saying, "Hello?" I usually thought nothing of it, attributing to the random nonsense generated by my brain while sleeping. The thing is, on the few occasions that it occurred, the voice was the same. None of it was relevant to the dream, and it always woke me up. Then, one night, it giggled, sort of like a two abrupt notes, the second being slightly higher pitched than the first. The kicker is, I wasn't really asleep for that one. I was trying restlessly to fall asleep, but had not gotten to it yet. It's on my bucket list now to see a ghost, but as of yet, I've only ever heard one. This final story takes place on the last week that we would be living in the house, and my mother was cleaning the baseboards in the kitchen, as she always had done many times before. By baseboards, I mean these metal heating vents that rely on propane. While my mum was cleaning, she came across a piece of paper. She figured that it must have been something that recently fell back there, as had happened on occasion, since the place where we kept business cards and such was right next to this spot. She pulls it out, and it's a picture of the previous owners of the house, with some other relatives of theirs. I think it was their cousins or something. My mum found this odd, considering how she'd cleaned back there for 9 years at this point, and only ever found this picture within the last week of living there. She gave it to the previous owners, who were at the time living next door. They, of course, gave her context to the photo, and that there was nothing unusual about it. It was just a picture of them next to some relative. Before you ask, no, the photo had not been taken after we moved in. That perhaps would have convinced me. But the fact that there was nothing spooky about the photo itself leaves me somewhat skeptical. Still, my mother thought it was the spirit's way of saying goodbye. There's actually a bonus story. My mother used to work part-time as a substitute lunch monitor at a school that was near where we used to live before moving into the house mentioned prior. She used to commute to the school by walking near the entire length of a massive cemetery. Technically, it was more than one, right next to each other. She would travel from its northeast corner into the school near the southwest one. Anyway, the story is that during one of her commutes, she found the entire ground to be black with crows. They were everywhere as far as you can see. My mum didn't think much of this, as they mostly just hopped out of her way as she walked down the road. What she didn't think about till later was the fact that not a single one of them was making a sound. On a different day, she was walking through the exact same cemetery in early spring, when she noticed a young girl in the distance wearing a dress. She found it upsetting that someone would leave their child unattended in a cemetery, in clothing very inappropriate for the weather. We later found out from someone who knows the story better that the girl is called Annabelle, and that she is commonly seen around crows. In fact, if anyone else is familiar with this particular spirit, I'd like to know more. I've been unable to find anything, other than the fact that she occasionally takes rides in the backseat of people's cars. I have had to deal with shadow people for a while. My first encounter was before I was 9. My siblings and I shared a room in my 2-bedroom house. My bed was on the lower bunk, the head of which gave me a pretty good view into the hall. I wake up feeling like someone was watching me. I checked the window and kind of just mull around for a bit. I turned over it and saw in the frame of the door a dark, shadowy silhouette of a woman. I could see the hall behind it, but her colour was that of like when you've fallen asleep, turn on a light, and then turn it off. That weird, flickering collage of colour and texture. I called out, "Mum?" and I didn't get a response. After a while of just standing there watching me, it left. It didn't feel sinister or good, just creepy and out of place. The next encounter was probably around the age of 11 or 12 at my grandparents' house. I decided to stay in a room I'd never slept in before. It never felt right to me, so I kind of avoided it. The sound was different in the room, kind of made my ears feel like they were pressurized. I go to sleep and feel the same creepy, someone's watching me feeling. I check the window. I've never been afraid of the dark or frightened by things in the closet or under the bed. But that night, I was. I checked both multiple times. Finally, I tried to persuade myself to go to sleep and turned the light off. After a while, I opened my eyes and saw 2 large shadowy figures at the foot of my bed. They both had that same look to them as the woman before. There was definitely outlines of their silhouettes. I could clearly see the dresser opposite me and looked normal in some places, but like there was a dark veil over others. I froze. I wanted to run out the room, but I couldn't get the nerve. I was paralyzed by fear. I began praying and saying phrases that my Pentecostal grandparents told me to do. Plead to the blood of Jesus, rebuke Satan, etc. But as much as I wanted to believe the protection of Jesus was upon me, I was terrified, and nothing was working. The figures began to grow, and the boundaries of the room had no effect on them. They grew as tall as trees and loomed over me. It was like the more afraid I became, the more power they had. Then, at my most terrified, it felt as though someone pours warm honey in my heart. You know those commercials that show how medicines flow through the body? It was like that. The warm and soothing feeling spread through my body, like a ripple of serenity coursed through me. And then they were gone, and I fell back asleep. The third time was the most significant event in my life. I believe I developed cancer and a rare infection as a child. I wound up in the ICU and they had to surgically remove the infection, which meant losing an eye. I was dying at 14, my body was shutting down, my urine was straight up black. I couldn't eat, I couldn't even go poop. The infection had done something to my nervous system and my legs were temporarily paralyzed. It was looking like the end. One night I was staying with my dad. I was rightfully depressed as hell and really didn't want to talk to anyone. I had spent every day pretending to be happy and holding conversations and dealing with the constant barrage of nurses and doctors every 15 to 30 minutes. I just didn't want to talk. Well, my dad was bored with me because I just wanted to have a pity party, so he got my grandma to come by with her friend. I wasn't in the mood for holy conversations about how God is good and your typical how you doing and hang in there conversations that we had anyway. They bought anointing oil and prayed with me. I closed my eye, the other being a huge infected bubble of decaying flesh at the time, and saw the outline of my room's door. I thought it was strange. Typically, burn-in images kind of drift around that aren't as defined as this, and I tried to wash the image away by moving my eye around, but it stayed where it was. Then the door opened. It didn't open much, just wide enough for the silhouette of a head to pop in. I sat there, shocked in horror and confusion and amazement, that I was watching a shadow person walk through a door in my head. thought it was death. It was a clear outline of a man, and I watched it walk up to the foot of the bed. I was praying not to die, for forgiveness for the myriad of sins I committed. It reached out its hand towards my face. It stretched from the foot of my hospital bed and touched my forehead, at the exact same time my grandma anointed my head with oil. I was freaked out. I didn't know what it meant. Was that it? Was I going to live or die? The prayer is wrapped up, and that night I prayed to God to tell me what it meant. I know it's not okay to ask God for validation of what just happened, but I was 13. Surely I could get a little leeway. I woke up the next morning knowing I wasn't going to die. It was as factual to me as if it had already happened. The family was stoked as well as I, but we didn't know that my life would ever be the same. I would always be disabled and never be able to hide it. The last time I saw them was the day of the surgery to remove the eye. Everyone was on edge. You could feel the adrenaline in the air. Nurses and doctors stream in and out of the room as they prep me for surgery. My family comes to say they love me one last time before I get taken into surgery, and possible death, as it was a pretty vicious infection, and they had to scrape my front brain lobe due to the infection beginning to attack it. It was do or die. I, on the other hand, already knew what would happen. I was going to survive. They gave me some relaxing medication as they unhooked me from my monitors, and I was kind of kicked back and cruising. I began to see shadow people all around my bed, 3 or 4 on each side. They were not like the ones I saw at my grandparents' house. They were good. I tried to speak to them a few times, but they didn't respond. I thought it was hilarious that people were walking through them and didn't even realize it. I noticed a white light in the corner of my eye as well. It was like looking at a dimly lit star. You can't really see it when you look directly at it, but if you look to the side of it, you can make it out a bit. It was like the inverse of a shadow person, a light person, sitting in the chair my parents used when they stayed with me. I don't know if it was him or not, but it was comforting to see.
This is my story. All of it is true. My roommate and I had just moved to Denver. His name was Tyler. He was gay, and for the first time in his life, he was surrounded by other gay people. For the first few weeks, I didn't see much of him. He was getting as much ass as he could, and I was content in our apartment alone. Nothing about it freaked me out. A photo on my wall had fallen off, and that was strange, but I figured it was just gravity. Tyler finally stayed the night in the apartment. We were sharing a bed because he hadn't gotten one yet. We were both drunk, and that night, as soon as I turned off the lamp, the blinds started moving. Tyler was freaked out, but I was drunk and tired and brushed it off as just a breeze. He went and slept in the living room. I stayed in the bedroom and told him to chill out and that it was nothing. Nothing else happened that night. But we did bring it back up the next day. We both laughed. I said, "What shall we name our ghost?" Tyler replied, "Bill." For the rest of the day, we continued to crack little jokes about Bill. That night, while getting ready into bed and about to turn off the lamp, Tyler whispered, "Bill doesn't like the dark." The blinds immediately started lashing all around. I turned the lamp back on, and we both sat up and just watched. I still wasn't convinced. He made me get out of bed to check where it was coming from because I wasn't scared. I looked for any kind of vent or open window, but nothing made sense. I had a little radio in the windowsill and it had fallen out. I put it back up, climbed back into bed and tried to calm Tyler. Again, I turned the lamp off. Then they started going again, but this time with far more intensity. We stared, and this time I did get scared. I did what anyone who thinks they may be encountering something did. I tried to talk to it. "Do you want us to leave?" The blinds were still going crazy. At that point I was terrified. I jumped out of bed and packed a quick bag and headed to my childhood friend's house. I didn't sleep that night. I just shuddered in fear. Our next journey would be to try and figure out a way to get rid of Bill. We headed back to the apartment because we needed the internet to find an exorcist. I went into the house, shaking in fear, sitting on the floor in the corner. Tyler called a few churches. We didn't actually get any help. We got really confused responses. Tyler stands up and looks in the kitchen. He covers his mouth and slowly walks backwards. The burners were all on, all of them, on different settings. I ran out the house. Tyler followed suit after turning the burners off. We sat in the car panicking. "We have to call the leasing office and get the hell out of this lease," I said. That was an awkward phone call. The manager didn't believe us and thought we were idiots, but I told her everything stated above. She said that she would look into it and call us back. "I left my cigarettes in the house," Tyler cried. But screw that, I wasn't about to go back in there. He talked me into standing by the front door while he grabbed them. All of the water sources were on, every sink and shower in the apartment. I'm hysterical at this point and run to the car. "We have to turn the water off, dude." I collected myself and walked to the door again with him. Perfect timing. 2 leasing ladies came down because we were the talk of the office. I asked her to please turn off the water because we were too scared. We all stood inside by the front door and told them the whole story. One of them put her hand over the burner. "They're still warm." They didn't make that up. They kind of believed us, but not really. Well, that's not until the maintenance guy encountered Bill. Todd. Apparently after we left, Todd and his co-worker were walking past my apartment. He said he was laughing with them about our story. Right as he walked by, the deadbolt locked. He looked at the other guy, and then he grabbed his keys. No one's supposed to be in there. Bit weird. He knocked on the door for a while, but no one came. So he stuck his set of keys into the door, and it felt like someone was holding the deadbolt shut. He couldn't open it. He tried the balcony door as we were on the first floor, and that wouldn't unlock either. He tried again with the front door, and then it unlocked with ease. After that point, they actually believed us, and allowed us to live in a different apartment. The next day sucked. I had to repack again, but I couldn't stay in the house because I was just terrified to death. I had some guy who wanted to sleep with me move everything for me. We spent the entire day moving, and I laid on the dining room floor with a boy who liked me. It honestly just felt good to be held. I played in his arms, and I watched the blinds slowly close by themselves. I cried. Moving didn't help. We did all of that stuff for nothing, and now I'm in a layout I hate. We continued to try and find a way to get rid of Bill ourselves. That included blacking out every night and mocking it. Ugh, we were so stupid. We bought some more sticker decal to decorate our rooms. He bought a big Paris sticker which he stuck and put on our wall. It ripped off. We put it back up. It peeled right off. I thought it could just be the wall paint because I was trying to think logically like a normal person, and nothing else happened on the first day. But then it escalated. Bill would pound on our bedroom wall from the minute we laid down to about 10 a.m. every night. We'd hardly sleep. I even laid by the wall to make sure it wasn't Tyler messing with me. One night, my upstairs neighbor came down very upset. It was super fun to try and explain to my neighbor that it wasn't us banging on the walls. It was some sort of demon asshole thing. I even brought him into my room. He saw it with his own eyes and said, "Must be a raccoon in your wall or something." Yeah, a raccoon. People really don't want to believe in ghosts, do they? It messed with us to the point where we were scared and we couldn't sleep. It would change the shower water to scalding hot, throw lit candles off counters, and just do lots of annoying stuff. But things started to get worse when Tyler finally saw it. I couldn't find him. It was almost bedtime, so he was going around the house turning off the lights. I didn't see him again. "Tyler?" No response. "Tyler, where are you? Why are the lights off?" I turned the bedroom light on. He was in bed, bundled up, completely covered. "What are you doing?" He wouldn't look at me. "Tyler, I'm getting scared." I saw him. I was so scared. I couldn't explain what kind of fear I felt. "Where?" I tried comforting him. He was crying. In the bathroom. I went to turn off the light. He was right there. He had no eyes. We both sat up in the corner of the bedroom all night. We did act like total idiots and let our friends stay the night, and they didn't believe us. We would mock it and watch it thrash around mirrors and bang the walls, and they would stare in awe. God, we were really stupid. We couldn't do this anymore. We needed help. I ended up writing to a ghost hunter show, and she wanted to fly out to film if things escalated, but we couldn't wait. In the meantime, she did refer me to some guy who I'll call Zach. We met Zach at a local diner and explained everything. He came over to the house but couldn't sense a thing. He told us it was unlikely it was a ghost, that he'd been doing it for 20 years and only once encountered one, and it was because a family member was trapped there with some voodoo stuff. He said it was likely an entity. I still don't really understand what that means, but I knew it was real, and he gave us some directions on how to get rid of whatever it is. He told us to get salt and some other things, put them in bowls in the corner of the rooms of the house, to burn some sage, to open all the windows around us and to yell, "Get out," but to not do it lightly, no laughing, that we had to mean it. He said if anything new happened, to document it and report back to him. He told us to never acknowledge or talk about it in the house, and to never give it a name. Oops. That night, my childhood friend and boyfriend and Tyler all began the process. No one laughed. The energy around us was tense and silent. We did what we had to do and went out for pizza. These things only awoke the beast even more. We got home late and I went to the bathroom. The ball of salt had been flipped over. I was confused and went to check the others. They were all flipped over. When we left, we put the sage in a kitchen drawer. When we got home, it was shredded all over the floor, like you could do it with your bare hands or whatever. The drawer was still open. Later that night, Tyler and I were on the couch watching TV when he starts crying and pointing to the kitchen. "Look!" I didn't see anything. "He's right there, can't you see him?" No, thank God, because I don't know if my heart could handle that. As soon as Tyler would look away, he said, "Bill disappeared." He was so scared and asked me to get him a soda. I didn't want to, but I understood his fear. I walked into the kitchen and grabbed it. One of the salt bins was ripped open. Again. I don't even know how that happened. It was lying on its side. Obviously, neither of us had done it. We had both reached maximum creep out at this point. It didn't take long for everything to escalate to a point where we could no longer deal with it. So Tyler and I tried to spend as little time as possible in the apartment. Sometimes we even ended up sleeping in the car. The activity was getting insane, things being thrown, and it was simply too challenging to deal with life at this point. I'll cut a long story short here. Tyler and I got into a huge falling out. I don't want to say what it was about, but he showed his true colors, and after that, I didn't want to have anything to do with him. Tyler ended up moving out, and once he did, everything ceased. I can't make this up. It was like a weight had been lifted over me and the apartment. The ambience of it felt completely different. I had a final conversation with Zach, who told me that he was pretty sure that would happen, as he was relatively certain that the entity, whatever it was attached to Tyler. I don't know what happened to Tyler now, but I do have severe PTSD, even just remembering this. It's a bit anticlimactic, really, him leaving and everything stopping, but I am truly so grateful that it did end once he left. I could move on with my life, but I do have quite severe PTSD. I can't even watch scary stories anymore, and can't sleep without a nightlight. Who knows what Tyler did to attach that entity to him? Maybe it was always in the apartment waiting for someone to latch onto, but in any case, I'm glad that I'm free of it.
When I was 13 to 14 years old, I lived in an older house. I shared a room with my foster brother, who was also convinced that there was something strange going on there. For months we would hear breathing or very faint whispers at night as we turned out all the lights to sleep. We decided to move around the beds and TV stand to see if we could hear things wrong. But the first night, and most nights after, I would feel something moving and push against the bottom of my mattress at night. When my foster brother was out the house, I would hear sighs and creaks from under his bed. We were both out the house one day, and when I returned that night, my foster parents told me they thought we were home all day because they heard something slamming stuff around my room, but neither of us had been there until I got back that night. Eventually we all went on vacation, but hours after we left, the house had caught fire with an undetermined source. Apparently that's the third house of theirs that had burnt down. My foster parents were old country-living Christians and really didn't have any baggage. My foster brother and I had played a few horror games on our Xbox, but nothing too chaotic or nightmare-inducing. It was a very spread-out community, and we lived on the other side of the road from a cemetery. I haven't returned to the property since. In 2009, my cousin died. I remember that night like a movie scene. I woke up at 3 a.m. because I heard my father crying desperately. Some relatives told him about my cousin's death after falling from an apartment after a drink party. I didn't know how to react that night. We were just sad about it. The next day my father had to travel to another city for work, so in the night, me and my two brothers were sleeping together in my father's room. The interesting thing is that we were all pretending to sleep that night. Suddenly I hear some footsteps near the room. The door was closed. Me, being the youngest brother, just hugged my big bro because I was so afraid. That's when I realized he heard it too. He said, "Did you hear that?" I couldn't say anything, I just stayed quiet. And then the freaking door opens by itself, but in a really gentle way, like a person did it, and see nothing but dark. In that moment, my big brother of 15 stands up and looks for a knife or something in that room. We were scared because we thought it was a robber, but we didn't find any. There were no more noises and all the other doors were closed. We still remember that night, and think it was our cousin visiting us, one final goodbye. Just the way the door opened was so unnatural. I used to live in a heritage house in the Philippines growing up. Heritage houses, for those unaware, are like really, really old and still functioning houses, most from the 17 to early 1900s. While most have been converted into museums, my family had lived in one for generations. Now this house had seen 2 world wars and was once used as a makeshift hospital to treat wounded soldiers during these wars. So I don't really know where to start. On some nights you could distinctly smell gunpowder and rusting iron, as well as burning tires around the house, but the smell would disappear as soon as you leave the front door. On other nights, you'd get the occasional footsteps or random windows opening or closing, with no explanation whatsoever. But the strangest and the most real experience for me was when I had some of my friends over. We just entered high school, which now is the equivalent of middle school first year, and we were telling each other jokes around the living room. When I kid you not, we hear a basketball dribbling from inside the house. I've now grown used to unexplained noises, but my friends decide to investigate. Lo and behold, we see a basketball roll by the dining room into the kitchen. Then we heard it dribbling again, by itself. One of my friends who investigated said he legit saw it bounce up and down, so they got really scared and went home. I followed him because peer pressure, and after that, they refused to hang out at my place. I told this story to my mum, and the next thing I know, there's a shaman in my house spreading salt all over the dining room floor. I had a black cat called Casper. We adopted her after she ran away from the previous owners. She was missing for days before the previous owners found her in the bushes, skittish and frightened. After carrying her home, the owners discovered she was allergic to cats, when her arm broke out with rashes. The call for a new home came and was answered by my animal-loving family. For ages, she was too scared to come near anyone, totally adverse to being petted. Eventually, she turned into a total sook, never missing the chance to jump on you and lie with you. We loved her, and I loved her heaps. You could feel genuine affection out of that one. Then one day, she lost the use of her back legs. Not long after she passed away. I was having a rough time then, and she was a big comforter. Point is, me and my parents were sad. A few days after, I'm sitting on my front steps having a smoke, and I hear a meowing sound identical to Casper. I look out front, and there at the gate was a cat meowing at me. That looked just like her. I went over and it ran away. I looked down the street, and it was gone. I mentioned it to my parents, and they both said they had the same thing happen to each of them separately, which was a surprise to them too. Now, it could have just been a coincidentally similar cat from the neighborhood, but it only happened once to each of us, and then it was never seen again. Plenty of room for more rational explanations, but I choose to think that Casper says thanks before snuggling onto that big belly in the sky.
An ex of mine had a young son who had a tendency to sit up at night and talk to his friend. No biggie, kids and their imaginations, right? One day the girlfriend and I ordered a pizza, set up a movie, and the kid gets washed for bed. In his bath, I asked if he was ready to go to sleep, and he said that it would be lonely. I asked why, and he said his friend left. Fast forward 30 minutes, as I kill the lights to his bedroom and say goodnight, he turns to me with the biggest grin on his face and say, "He's here. He's back." That was when the doorbell rang. I about crapped my pants. Turns out it was just the pizza guy.
My dad was out with his girlfriend about 2 hours away from home, and I had the entire house to myself. I wasn't expecting them for at least 4 to 7 hours, when I heard the garage door open. It has a very distinctive sound due to the way it echoes through the kitchen and across the open-plan tiled house. Immediately I heard the clicking of his girlfriend's boots and knew it was her from how short she was compared to the rest of the family. She walked like she had something to prove, something to make up for her height. She was definitely saying something to my dad too as she entered, and I could hear him say something back. Since it was so early for them to be home, I had a feeling something was off. I was already basically done with my shower, so I hopped out and threw a towel on, opening the door and looked down at the hall and across the house for them. I absolutely pulled the horror movie rookie move of investigating in a towel, walked the length of the house and saw the gate outside was still closed, opened the door to the garage and saw it empty, and even did an extra loop to rule out missing something. I was 100% home alone still. This wasn't the first time I'd heard something while being home alone. It was just the most distinct. My whole family has heard the slider doors open. When I went car shopping with my dad, my sister heard the garage door and the door in the house from the garage open. No one came home either then. My dad has seen people on the property at 3 a.m, but they're gone without a trace and too fast for a real criminal to be snooping. The house just makes noises that imitate us and aspects of the home. The walls don't bleed though. That's why we still live there. We had a cat called Zoe who sadly passed away in February of 2019 from cancer. She was exceptionally close to my son and extremely gentle with him, even when he was a boisterous toddler. It was his first real encounter with death, and at 4 years old he was able to understand the finality of it. One night in the spring of 2019, my son woke me at around 2 or 3 a.m. to say that one of the cats was on the bed and awoken him. He asked if I could get the cat off the bed, as it was disturbing his sleep. We had 2 remaining cats at the time, a big grey cat and a white cat named Jack, and a black cat named Minerva. Jack was sleeping on the bed with my husband and I, so I figured it might be Minerva. As I came down to my son's bedroom, not only did I see Minerva sleeping on the couch, but I also discovered that his door was closed, both cats accounted for. I opened his bedroom door to investigate the room. For what? I'm not sure, seeing as both cats I'd already seen. I explained to my son that his door was closed and both cats were outside his room. Was he certain he saw the cat? He said yes, that she was right at the foot of his bed, but he didn't see her anymore. He had put the blankets over his head and tried to get some sleep, and when he looked after that, the cat was gone. He didn't have a nightlight, so his room was very dark, and he couldn't make out any detail, which is why he didn't know which cat it was. He said it was the silhouette. As far as we could tell, it was the ghost of Zoe coming to visit my son that night to make sure he was okay, just as she did when he was alive. He feels guilty he didn't give her a more enthusiastic response, but since he didn't know it was one of our existing cats, he didn't know to. To this day, he says he hopes that she comes to visit again, so perhaps he can interact with her and let her know how much she is missed. My dad lived in an Art Deco house from the 30s in the UK. It was rather cool looking. There were pictures of me and my sister over the mantelpiece. He would always say about how the pictures would be facing the wrong way, convinced he had them facing the right way. I had seen the pictures facing the wrong way a few times, but was pretty sure he was playing a trick on me, just to try and spook me. Years pass and he has moved. I've gone into work as a builder and doing some work for a lady and having a chat. Turns out her daughter had recently moved into the street my dad used to live on. Not only that, but it turns out to be the same house. I say it's a cool looking house, and she agrees, and in her words she goes, yes, it's a good looking house with a lot of character, but she complains because the pictures keep turning themselves around. I was gobsmacked. Maybe my dad wasn't doing it after all, and there was something there that didn't want to see the faces in the photos. My mum had to put her dog down of 16 years a few years ago. They were absolutely inseparable. They went everywhere together and relied on each other through tough times. It was really hard on my mum, so I came down to visit her and spent some time with her over a few days. My mum was at work until 10 p.m. that night, and I left the house to go pick up something and eat for dinner. I came back in the house at around 8 and step into the kitchen. I flick the light on over the sink and start washing some dirty dishes before my mum comes home. All the other lights in the house were off, but we always kept our house locked up as well. As I'm washing dishes, I hear a dog whimper clear as day. I even think to myself, oh, maybe he's hungry or wet. The last year of his life, her dog's health had deteriorated to where he was basically bound in his doggy bed and had to be fed soft food by hand. He was also incontinent and had to be cleaned up regularly, and I tell myself I should go check on him. And that's when it dawns on me that he's dead. I turn off the tap and look back to the living room, and again I just hear it, like he used to, but this time it was softer. I turn on all the lights and look around the house for the source of the sound but find nothing. The next day, I hear the sound of his dog nails clicking on the hard wood. There's no dog in the house. At this point, I'm in a high state of denial. I can't tell my mum about what I'm experiencing because I don't want her falling into a weeping mess. She's experienced a lot of guilt and sadness about having to put him down. So the last night I was there, we were in her bedroom talking. She turns out the light to say she's going to sleep, and I'm lying on the bed and put my head down and tell her I'll go to the sofa in a sec. There's a lull in the conversation for a few seconds, and then a whimper as clear as day. She shoots up in bed and turns on the light and says, "Did you hear that?" and looks as though she's on the verge of tears. I sit up and say, "Yeah, sorry, I yawned." I get up and leave. I don't especially believe in ghosts, but this is a situation I cannot explain. I'm a 40-year-old male, and this happened when I was 28. Me and my child's mother had just had our first son in Knoxville, Tennessee. and decided to move back here for plain out logistics. All of my family's here. I had no work there, and my family wanted me back. So at the time I had a travel trailer we were living in. So pulling it into town I got pulled over, not having extended mirrors, pulling said trailer. I knew I had a warrant, basically just had to do 20 days. Sorry, all of this does relate to the story. So while I'm in jail, my kid's mother Jessie, and my grandma and her boyfriend and my parents went looking for a house to rent for me and Jessie, as she complained she hated the trailer. Boy oh boy, how she would be eating those words later. At this point I should fill you in on the fact that I'm sensitive. The first memories I've had were of ghosts, growing up in a horribly haunted house. So in short, I can walk in a house and feel if there are spirits. Saying that, if I would have looked at the house they got for us, I would have said no way. Now don't get me wrong, I'm grateful for their help, but if they had any idea what was to come, they'd have agreed. Fast forward to my release date, 20 days. So we got dropped off in the neighborhood, as I had a few friends there, and even though we had nothing but a few blankets, decided to stay there that night anyway. So that night we decided for whatever reason to stay in the living room on the back wall across from the picture window with no curtains. So that whole night I could swear sometimes I was looking at us through the window, but of course no one was there. At this point I already felt that something was off, even just coming up to the house. The way that it looked under that one street lamp on that one part of the street. It was creepy. That darkness that just seemed darker than it should be. Then that omen house feeling, like the house is looking at you type thing. Fast forward, we're there for a month or so, and started getting it together, and started bringing our son, Jason, home with us. Jason was about 10 months old at this point, so the first memorable night we laid Jason down and come back to the living room. It was around 10, and it sounded like Jason started choking, startling, and coughing. Then began screaming his head off. So we brought him out for a little bit, calmed him down, laid him back down, and the same thing happened again. So, of course, we're lost as what's happening. And finally all of us go to bed, and the next night the same thing happens. Guess I should say that the bedroom was a little uncomfortable, but nothing major. I thought it was us just getting used to the new house. His crib was in our old room, and we had no issue while it was in there with him. We had my parents watch him for the weekend, which was the next 2 days after the event. Things were a little bit of a blur as to what the exact time frame is here, but I know it was in the next few days. We went to sleep, I woke up, arms crossed in front of my stomach, and felt like something was sitting on my chest, hands on my mouth. I had never heard of sleep paralysis, but at least in my case, I tried to scream, and if you ever scream with a hand over your mouth, you know the noise it makes. Well, I was making that noise, trying to smack my partner's side to help, because I thought I was going to die. I blacked out, came to it, and Jessie woke up, and I told her what happened. Now she's a believer, otherwise she would have thought I was crazy, and I told her that it felt like something had tried to kill me. Then I explained what happened, and I think neither one of us slept that night. So me and her had the agreement that if she's up, she'll check. Make sure I don't have a terrified look on my face but not move. Well, the next time it happened, it was the same thing. I woke her up after and we were both freaking out. The order in which things happened are a little blurry, being 12 years ago now, but in one of the episodes, she actually did catch it and successfully got me out of it. Gasping for air, cussing and saying, "Screw this, we're moving to the living room." Yep, just like all the ghost shows, we ended up refusing to use our bedrooms. At this point I filled my parents in on what was going on, since now I figured out that whatever was trying to harm me was doing the same thing to my son. I can't even begin to tell you how we felt once we both realized that. Basically, we were laying our son down with a ghost that had a choking fetish. So we were living in the living room. It's getting cold and you can't keep this house warm. I mean, it's a 700 square foot house, that the furnace ran non-stop, and you could actually feel wind go straight through the house no matter how much sealing I did. I mean to the tune of a $250 gas bill a month. So we're laying in front of the TV and decided to turn it off. Jessie is already asleep. I turn the TV off and lay there waiting to fall asleep as well. In the corner I see a shape forming. I think I'm tripping. It looks like the Grim Reaper, but there's no such thing. And in the classic cloak and scythe, no less. 8 feet tall, darker than midnight. And after staring at him for a while, I somehow pass out. I wish to note that I never told anyone what I saw. I figured that I'd just be thrown in the loony bin at that point. Fast forward a few more weeks in which I keep seeing things every night there. My partner's also telling me she does as well, so I know it's not just me. But as long as I didn't sleep in that room, I don't have the supposed sleep paralysis episodes, as they only happen there. We're planning on moving but didn't have the money, and just have to endure the hell. You know the funny thing, out of all the things that happened at this house, we never had things thrown at us or moved. So the last night we're there, we're laying in front of the TV. I roll over a little after midnight, tell Jessie I love her, and good night, and I switch the TV off. Then this dark shadow thing is standing in the corner as always, and I can feel its gaze, and can't help but stare, but there's no way this is real, no way. I lay there staring at it for what feels like ages, and then turned the TV back on, and said forget this, and laid back down. I thought my partner was already asleep, I never looked, and literally, when I turned the TV on, she said, forget this, out loud. The shadow figure was gone, with the light of course. I kid you not 10 seconds later. Then my partner jumps up and says, hey, did you see the figure standing in the corner? At that point it confirmed. It wasn't just me. We throw everything in the car and make a break for it. No way we were going to stay there any longer. Thanksgiving is about a month after my birthday. When I was 2, my brother Patrick was about 5 months old. My father Pat and mother Sally were invited to have Thanksgiving with friends, a young couple, Alice Ann and Frank Nudler. As the Nudlers were young and had yet to start a family, they didn't have much money. They had recently rented an old Victorian house just outside of town, an hour or two from Wichita, Kansas. They had rented it for a much lower price than it should have been on the market, so they felt very lucky to have gotten such a large house at that price. They had not been living there for more than a month. As the house was large and somewhat drafty, Alice Ann and Frank had decided to live downstairs, using only the kitchen, living room, parlor, and old servant's bedroom off the kitchen. They spent most of their time in the kitchen to stay warm, but had set up the dining room and parlor to accommodate their guests for Thanksgiving. When Pat and Sally arrived, they both commented on how gothic and large this old house was. It seemed strange for their young friends to be living there, but they shrugged it off and headed to the door. They were warmly greeted by their good friends and immediately began to socialize and settle in for the evening of festivity. It had begun to snow, so a cheery fire was put on in the parlor. After a bit, my brother and I were put down for a nap in the small servant's room off the kitchen. Pat and Alice Ann had drifted off into the parlor and were sitting and talking while Frank and Sally were in the kitchen doing minor preparations for their dinner. They were all having a lovely time, flirting and talking as young couples do, when Pat thought he saw someone out of the corner of his eye walk across the living room just outside the parlor. He casually asked Alice Ann if there was anyone else who had been invited to dinner. Alice Ann looked a bit confused and said, "No, why do you ask?" He replied that he thought he just saw a man in the living room. Alice Ann was quiet for a moment and looked perturbed but murmured, No one else." As the afternoon wore on, the snow became quite heavy, and Alice Ann suggested that Pat and Sally stay the night to avoid driving home through a snowstorm. They had 5 bedrooms upstairs after all, so there was plenty of room. The house was partially furnished, and all the rooms had beds, so they agreed. It would probably be best to stay and leave in the morning, they thought. After dinner, Alice Ann handed Pat a set of old skeleton keys and told him the room upstairs were always kept locked. She suggested that they go up and select a room for his small but growing family. Pat thought it was a bit odd that the doors were locked, but thought probably the landlord had stipulated this for rental agreement purposes. So shrugging his shoulders, he climbed the stairs to the second floor. The stairs ended in a small landing, and as you turned to face a narrow, long and dark hallway with 2 bedrooms on each side or other end, the first thing he noticed was the abrupt drop in temperature as he ascended. He didn't think too much about it, as it was snowing, after all, and there was no heat or fires lit upstairs. It did seem to be extraordinarily cold, though. He shivered and moved down the hall and began to open the doors upstairs. He thought that he would open each room and allow his beautiful wife Sally to pick the room she wanted. He intended to leave the doors open to allow some heat to penetrate before having her come up to select the room. As he moved around, he felt an odd prickling feeling, as though he were being watched. He shrugged it off and laughed to himself quietly, as he thought he was just scaring himself. As he opened the last door, he headed for the stairs, and had just stepped down a stair or two, when behind him he heard a slow creak, followed by the sound of a door closing with a click. He slowly turned to see the first door closed, and the second door creaking closed with another click, followed by the third, and the fourth, and the fifth. He stood there for a moment trying to rationalize what he had just seen and heard. He decided there must be a draft, or the house being old might be causing the doors to close. So back up he went to reopen the doors, only to find that they were all locked again. Feeling somewhat bewildered, he rationalized, thinking it must be something to do with the age of the house and how the doors worked. He began unlocking them all over again, opening them and moving them back and forth to see how they would close on their own, but they seemed perfectly fine. Shrugging his shoulders, he finished opening them and again began to descend the stairs, only to hear another creak and slam. This time, the doors were closing with a bit more force, much harder and louder. He froze on the stairs and watched the remaining doors creak closed with a slam one by one. At this point, he decided it would be best to come back with Sally to pick a room. He felt discomfort and a bit unsure to why this was happening, but decided to say nothing. Well, what could he even say? He didn't want to sound silly, nor did he want to scare his wife. When it was time to retire to bed, Pat gathered his sleepy children and his wife and headed up the stairs with some misgivings, but didn't say a thing. He unlocked and opened several doors, and Sally chose the room closest to the stairs. After closing and locking the other rooms, they made their way in to dress for bed. Pat prepared the pallet on the floor next to his side of the bed for 2-year-old me and my brother Patrick. Patrick was nestled in his bassinet on Sally's side, and after bundling everyone in and making sure we were all warm and as comfortable as possible under the circumstances, the lamp on the side of the bed was turned off and they all drifted off to sleep. Sometime later, around 3 a.m, Pat awoke to hear a toddler giggling and the pitter-patter of tiny feet running around the room. Assuming it was little me, he said quietly but firmly, so as not to wake the wife or boy, "Maeve, get back to bed." It was then that he noticed how very cold the room was. It seemed an otherworldly kind of cold, a stilling chill that penetrated your very soul. The sound continued, and he repeated, "Maeve, get to bed." But hearing no answer, but another quiet giggle and more footfalls, he rose his eyebrow and exasperatedly flicked on the lamp at the side of the bed. That was when he was met with utter shock, because I was there quietly sleeping next to him, snuggled in my blankets. Sally groggily asked what was happening. Pat, feeling stunned and confused as well as shaken, quietly shook his head and told her that he was just checking on me to make sure I was covered okay. Sally immediately rolled over and was sleeping peacefully, almost before he finished his sentence. Pat turned off the lamp and lay there, puzzled, wondering what the hell he just heard. After dwelling on it for a few more minutes, he drifted off and nothing else happened for the rest of the night. In the morning he woke up, as the first bit of light crept into the room. He lay there thinking and wondering what had happened in that night. Finally he shrugged it off as he could not find a rational explanation. However, when he arose from bed he froze, for there on the dusty old wooden floor were tiny footprints all over the room. They weren't mine, as he had carried me in, already sleeping, and tucked me away into my pallet the night before. Some weeks later the Nuddlers moved out. They told Pat and Sally the house was too creepy and cold, but later they admitted that she had heard them too. She'd seen the man in the living room, and they had heard strange sounds and cries and screams coming from the rooms above them. It turns out that at the beginning of the 20th century, a family living there, a man and his wife and small children, had all been murdered by an axe in that house. Or so my father tells us. When I researched the murders in the early 20th century in Kansas, I came across a murder that occurred in Atkinson, in which a small family had been murdered and discovered by a family the following evening. However, the house was not Victorian and was far smaller than the house my father described, although he was prone to embellishing his stories, which he did quite well, and to the delight of his listeners, because it always made the story that much better. I live in a very rural area. The neighbours to my right are a quarter of a mile away and are Mennonite. There are tons of farmland and hills between them and me. The neighbours across from me are older, quiet, and go to bed at about 7 p.m. And the neighbours to my left move out this weekend. I live in a house on a little under an acre of property. Our houses are pretty spaced out along the back road we live on, not a development, and we don't get many cars through here, mostly horse and buggies. The corn is high right now, so it dampens noise from other houses, but it's generally quiet around here. I have 2 kids of 2 and 9 weeks old, and their father lives in the house too. My 2-year-old has the first bedroom, my bedroom is next to hers, and the 9-week-old sleeps in my room, and their dad has the master bedroom across from my room. The 2-year-old's door is always shut when she's sleeping, but the rest of us keep our doors open at night. I've always had anxiety about people breaking into my house, which has never happened to me before, but too many scary movies and TV shows growing up will do that to you. I notice every noise at night. I have a direct view to the master bedroom from my room, and it's very obvious when he gets up to leave his room. At night when everyone is settled in, I've been hearing noises in the walk-in basement, to the point where I have scurried from the living room to the master bedroom to ask their dad to check out the basement. When he goes down and checks, he doesn't ever see anything, but he always checks for peace of mind. Last night, I had probably the most heart-racing, body-shaking, in-fear experience. It was about 3 a.m, and I heard a car door shut outside, which is totally out of the norm, but I was like, okay, take a breath. I'm sure the neighbors just needed to get something from the car. So about 5 minutes later, I got up and peeked out the windows in my room, and I didn't see anyone or anything. I also would be able to see headlights shining through if a car was turned on at my neighbors driving down the road or in my driveway. And about 5 minutes after that, I heard noises coming from either the master bedroom or the basement, presumably the kid's father doing something. I got up and peeked into the master bedroom, and he was laying on the futon asleep. So I creeped down the hallway to the bathroom and peeked in to see if my 2-year-old had maybe wandered out of her room, but she hadn't. So I went back and sat on my bed. Then another 5 minutes go by, and I hear clattering in the sink, like metal on metal clattering. Sounded like someone was dropping utensils into it. So I jumped up and my heart started pounding. I was watching the walls to see if I saw any shadows. I finally got the courage to scurry across the hall and woke up my kid's father. I told him what I'd heard, so he stumbled into the kitchen, me about 2 feet behind him, no one was there. So I went to examine the sink, and a dirty fork was sitting in it. I had just done the dishes after dessert, so the sink should have been empty, and I was the last person out the kitchen. I walked over to the basement door and saw it was cracked. I knew I shut it when I came up from doing laundry, so I asked the kid's father if he had left the door to the basement open. He said, yeah, I probably did that when I came back up. I'm pretty sure he was bluffing, because I don't think he went into the basement yesterday at all. So he moved our heavy iron-made kitchen chairs in front of the basement door and locked it. So then I checked out the rest of the house, closets, pantries, bathrooms, and decided it must be in my head. So I sat back down in my room. Then I heard more noises. I heard footsteps coming up and down the basement. Then everything went quiet. I heard a bang on the wall from my daughter's room, which was her just flipping over in her sleep. A few times I heard more noises from the screen to my window, but when I looked out I saw nothing. Then around 5:15 a.m. I heard a car door shut again, which could have just been my neighbour leaving for work, but I didn't see anything when I looked out the window, and I heard no more noises. To sum it up, I heard a lot of noises and found a dirty fork in the sink. I didn't see anyone, and nothing was disturbed. We have 3 couches in the basement set up to relax on, my escape spot for the kids. So, is it possible someone is breaking through the basement door and somehow sleeping on the couches? I haven't been down there to check, as I'm still scared. We have a Ring doorbell on the front, but it's been dead for a while, so I'm charging it up tonight. It's more believable to me that it's paranormal activity than a squatter. This area is super safe, and I just don't know or see how or why anyone would be here or do anything in our home. Nothing was taken, but this isn't the first time. I've had plenty of nights like this. I had a strange experience when I was growing up. I was around 12 and coming up from the basement. I was walking up the first few steps when I turned to my left and see a tall woman the size of the door walking through the basement hallway. She was super thin and literally the size of the door and almost translucent. You can bet I hauled ass up the stairs and didn't go down for literal months, and never returned down there by myself again. Then there was the time I was sitting in my bed around 17 or 18. I couldn't sleep and was watching some movies on my laptop. My closet door swung open. Didn't sway or anything, just quickly swung wide open and stopped immediately before hitting the wall. I threw my covers over my face and froze in fear until the morning, and couldn't sleep a wink. It was that traumatic. Then there was the white dog everyone in my family saw at least once running around on the main floor. As far as I knew, the dog was chill. Then there was the baby story. My niece was 2. We, my family and I, were sitting in the living room and all of a sudden she gets a very serious look on her face and stares at the corner of the room where no one is and says, "Baby." She immediately makes a beeline into the corner of the room with a big smile on her face. Then the smile falls and she stops in her tracks and says, "Where'd baby go?" We all look at each other in disbelief and still talk about it to this day. That kid is also super connected to death. She used to remember how she died. My dad was watching Hindenburg footage on a documentary, and she saw it and said, "That's how I died. There was so much fire." She was 3 or 4, and then wouldn't answer any more about it. But back to the house. You could always hear doors slamming in the basement if you were quiet in the mornings. One morning, just my dad and I were home, and he said, "You ever just sit here and hear the doors slam downstairs?" So we sat up and listened, and before long we heard one slam. Lastly, my whole family went on vacation one summer, but I stayed because I had to work. I was in the living room watching TV as I refused to sleep upstairs alone. Must have been around 2 a.m, and I hear the shower turn on. I'm crapping myself as I'm walking very slowly to the bottom of the step to see if I'm hearing it right. Then all of a sudden I hear the shower handle squeak and turn off, and then I ran out of that place so fast and stayed with friends until my family returned. It took me about a week to move out into my own place after they returned. It was starting to mess with me mentally. I know the house was haunted. Also, the neighbors that moved in after us, their kid got incredibly sick about a month after moving into the house. The house had passed inspection with flying colors before selling, no mold anywhere, but now there was black mold all of a sudden, and it put the kid in the hospital for days. I mean, I'm not saying the house tried to kill the kid, but I'm not saying that it didn't. I'm a 40-year-old male, but when this happened I was 24 years old. It even makes me old to say this, but Facebook hadn't even become popular yet, and I had never heard of MySpace. Well, I started a Facebook account to keep up with my family all over the state, and in other states. 3 days after I started that Facebook account, this woman that looked my age sent me a friend request. I thought she was beautiful, so I accepted her request. Soon after we started talking, her name was Tanya. After speaking for a few weeks, we went out on a date. No, this isn't where it gets weird yet. Me and Tanya dated for about a month before I got to meet her 2 kids. A few weeks later I met her parents, and she met my family. It was going really well with Tanya, and it was like a match made in heaven. On the weekends I would sleep over her house and we would take the kids out to the movies, eat out, and even Tains Hill State Park. We got along so great, I even got along great with her kids and family. When I talked to her dad if I could marry his daughter, yes, I'm old-fashioned, he said that I could. Well, I went and bought the ring, called up Tanya and asked if we could go out to eat the following weekend. This is the part where it starts getting weird. That weekend I was nervous. I couldn't wait and left my house so that I could be on hers on time. But when I got there it was all boarded up, so I went to her parents' house. Her father asked, "Can I help you?" So I asked what happened to Tanya. What happened to the house? Where were they? Did it catch fire? And he looked at me like I was crazy. He asked how I knew his great-great-great-great-grandmother, and how did I know the house burnt down? I asked what he was speaking about, and I was saying, no, not your great-great-great-great-grandma. Your daughter. I have pictures to prove it. And I scrolled through my phone to show him pictures that were supposed to be of me and her, but it turns out they were of just me, and my family never recalled meeting her either. I don't believe in ghosts, but what happened to me in that year changed me. I just don't know. I feel like I'm going crazy, but I think my house might be haunted. Let me give you some background. Midwest, USA. I think it was all a wooded area a long time ago, but my great-grandparents built a house. Additions were added. I think they both just died of old age, but I'm not sure. But they gave the house to my dad when he was younger, married my mum, had me and my brother, who's 5 years younger, tore down the house that was here before, and built the house that we're currently living in. That was 15 years ago. I don't know that much about my great-grandparents. Great-grandpa died before I was born, and great-grandma died before I was in school. But my parents had a rough marriage. They fought a lot, and I remember getting bad enough that I would get kicked out of the house and go next door to my aunts. They both did things to each other that were not cool, and of course my brother and I got caught in the middle. They eventually divorced. Mom left. Dad met someone who moved in right away with her daughter. But apparently the daughter, who was 2 years younger than me, would try to summon demons and talk to spirits. She allegedly even tried turning the neighbor girl into a werewolf once, but that's a story for another day. Well, I was close with her mum, my dad's girlfriend. I struggled with mental illness and still do, but she helped me through a lot of it. In my freshman year of college, she ended her life within the house. A month later, Dad met someone again. They got married a year later. 2 years after that, and we're in the present day. And they are in the process of getting a divorce. But now that you've got the backstory, let me get into the experiences. My first night back from my first year of college, all my crap was in my room and on my bed. So where do I sleep?
in the living room on the couch. At the time I had 2 cats, and there was, and still is, a rocking chair that the ex-girlfriend would occasionally sit and rock in. Well, I was laying on the couch trying to sleep. One cat would be sleeping on my chest, and the other would sleep on the floor next to me. And I heard the chair start creaking, like someone in it was rocking. I didn't feel threatened or anything, but I felt spooked the hell out, and thought I was going crazy. I've been home for almost 2 months now since I graduated college. Dad and his wife were fighting, and she left about 3 weeks ago. After she left, I noticed something happen. We have a 2-story house. When I would be downstairs alone, the chandelier above the table would have a light that would flicker off when I wasn't looking, but come back on when I would look at it. Sometimes I would turn my head fast enough to catch it coming back on, and this happened several times. I didn't have to be home alone for it to happen, but I had to be the only person downstairs. My house also just felt off. I don't know how to describe it, but I always got these bad vibes. Even my fiancée feels it, and notices it when she's over. It just doesn't feel like home. This next part isn't my experience, but apparently things would be moved around in a manner that my great-granddad, my dad's grandma, would move things in a way only she would. The ex felt that the house was haunted 2 years ago. She and I had a conversation about it, and that's how I heard about the things being moved. So I think back to the problem. Reflecting on it, I think the problem was that my parents fought a lot. It was bad, malicious, a lot of resentment, but they tried staying together for the kids, which didn't work out well. I've struggled with depression since I was a child, and I've had lots of dark and morbid thoughts. Dad and his ex fought a lot too. Dad and his soon-to-be ex-wife fight a lot. The house just feels like a void of maliciousness, anger and resentment. A black hole that sucks out all things positive. Maybe something has caused this. Perhaps it was already here and we've only made it worse. I think the shenanigans the daughter did, certainly, didn't make matters any better. As for the light, as of now I can't think of anything besides the bad bulb that was somehow in sync with me, but I don't think anyone's changed it. What can I do? Do I have any options? I don't know where to go, where to start. All replies are welcome and appreciated. Oh, and I just remembered. The other neighbor's kid. The neighborhood kids aren't the right term as they live out in the middle of nowhere, but that's the closest thing I can call them, had several experiences with the ditch that runs on my family's property, but on the opposite side of the road. On our side, my aunt had a friend that was a medium. A long time ago, she said she saw something on her side of the ditch that runs between my and her house, and it was described as my great-grandpa digging roughly where there's a big rut that will mess you up on an ATV if you're driving on that back road. I don't know if the friend is still in the area. I think she moved. Nonetheless, all of these things really do scare me.